Hey guys, tonight we journey far beyond the lines of modern maps into a time when no charts or GPS guided the steps of travelers. Instead, people trusted stars, waves, and whispers of the earth itself. They read the sky like a book and let nature's signs lead the way. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of deep dive. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see our community spread across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step quietly into the ancient art of navigation together. People memorized landmarks and built mental maps. He didn't carry a compass. He didn't need parchment. He had no lines drawn in ink, no coordinates, no written chart to unfold under the stars. What he had instead was a world etched into memory, boulders like sleeping beasts, rivers that hummed like voices, trees twisted by wind into gestures of direction, and he knew them, every turn, every bend, every silent stone. Not by measurement, by rhythm, because before the map, there was the mind. Long before GPS or roads with names, before ink-stained cartographers, before even the idea that land could be owned, people navigated the world through something older than paper: memory maps. Landscapes weren't charted. They were sung, spoken, stored. Recalled not with numbers, but with stories. Because when everything depended on arriving, when water, safety, even survival hinged on finding your way back or forward, you didn't rely on luck. You relied on remembering. In ancient societies, especially among nomadic peoples, travelers passed down waymarks, verbal sequences of landmarks repeated in ritual cadence. The path to a sacred spring might be remembered as: past the ash tree burned by lightning, follow the stream until the split rock shaped like a man's back, then turn where the wind carves the grass flat. To the outsider, it was poetic nonsense. To the people who lived by it, it was precision. In Aboriginal Australian cultures, these memory paths became songlines, musical journeys across the continent. Each verse corresponded to a specific place, a physical feature in the land. To sing the song was to walk the world. To know the song was to possess a map made of melody. Some could travel hundreds of miles, never veering off path, by humming the landscape into alignment. Similarly, in medieval Europe, pilgrims heading to shrines like Santiago or Canterbury often followed memory chains, clusters of noted natural and man-made features, repeated by guides or passed mouth to mouth. A crooked oak near a well, a shrine of stacked stones, a carved face on a church wall. These were more reliable than many drawn maps, which often left out scale or were filled with errors. The land did not lie, but it had to be known. Among the Norse, sailors crossing ice-bound seas memorized cloud formations, watercolor, bird flight, and even the smell of air. The land was silent, but the signs were loud, if you had the memory to hold them. Polynesian wayfinders crossed vast oceans with no tools at all, memorizing star paths, wave patterns, and the shape of swells against their canoes. A child might begin learning the ocean's memory before they ever touched a sail, and these maps weren't just personal, they were sacred. In many cultures, remembering the path was a community task, a duty passed down like language or blood. An elder might recite the river's shape every night, not as nostalgia, but as infrastructure. If they forgot, someone might die. To build a mental map was to enter into contract with the land. You didn't just memorize the river. You understood where it swelled in spring, where it turned bitter in drought. You didn't just recall the rock. You knew the sound the wind made when it passed it in winter. It wasn't navigation. It was a living memory. This is why early cartographers often failed when trying to map regions like deserts or rainforests. The locals didn't speak in distance or direction. They spoke in sequence. The mountain that hides the sun leads to the lake where birds speak, they might say. And that wasn't metaphor. That was logistics. Some of the oldest known map-like carvings, such as the Bedolina map in the Italian Alps, show not roads, but constellations of landmarks, scratched into stone, not for art, but to recall how to get home. These weren't for strangers. They were reminders for those who already knew the land. Because memory isn't just stored in the mind. It's felt in the feet, in the stomach, in the way your chest tightens before a bend you know hides a cliff, in how your breath changes before the forest turns thick. This internal mapping is something modern science now tries to describe as cognitive mapping, the brain's ability to orient itself in space. But for our ancestors, it wasn't theory, it was survival. And not just for travel. Territory, justice, hunting grounds, even love stories were tied to places. A bend in the road wasn't just geography. It was where your grandfather saw the ghost. That grove of trees wasn't just shade. It was where your mother met the midwife who saved your life. Memory maps were more than direction. They were the archive of everything that mattered. To forget a landmark was to lose a piece of your identity. And so people remembered. They carved notches in sticks. They sang to the stones. They taught children that the hills had names and moods and stories. And those children grew into elders who could walk blind through fog and still find the path home. We've lost much of that now. Roads are labeled. Satellites tell us when to turn, but sometimes, in quiet places, echoes remain. The old path still has a twisted tree. The stones still form that face if you tilt your head just right. And maybe if you listen carefully, you can still hear someone, long gone, reciting the journey, not with coordinates, but with care. Because before the world was drawn in lines, it was held in the mind. And those minds knew how to see in ways no map ever could. Storytellers embedded directions into epic poems. In the flickering firelight of a prehistoric gathering, long before maps were inked or compasses spun, a voice rose in rhythm with the flames. It was the voice of a storyteller, not just a keeper of myth or memory, but a navigator. With every verse, every sung syllable, the land unfolded. Rivers curved through melody. Mountains rose in cadence, and sacred places, groves, coastlines, burial sites, revealed themselves not in diagrams, but in song. What seemed like poetry was also a map. Across countless ancient cultures, storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. It preserved knowledge, encoded law, taught morality. But hidden within the beauty of verse and the grandeur of epics, another function pulsed quietly. Direction, geography, movement. In places where written language was absent or rare, and where terrain was treacherous or sacred, stories became the threads tying people to the earth. Not metaphorically, literally. Indigenous Australian songlines are perhaps the most striking example. Epic poems that trace ancestral journeys across the entire continent. Each verse correlates with a landmark, a turn, a spring, a rock. To know the song was to know the land. You could walk thousands of miles guided by the rhythm of memory alone. The melodies weren't arbitrary. They carried pitch shifts and tempo changes designed to mimic terrain. A rising scale signaled ascent. A slow, mournful tone marked a dangerous crossing. And because the stories were spiritual, linked to the dreamtime and sacred creation myths, they were remembered with deep reverence and passed on with strict precision. But this phenomenon wasn't limited to Australia. Among the Polynesian voyagers of the Pacific, chants and mythic tales carried the stars within them. Stories of gods leaping from island to island encoded wind patterns, current directions, and navigational routes between distant atolls. A myth might say a hero followed a bird to a sacred island, but the seasoned wayfinder knew that this meant sailing east at sunrise and adjusting course when specific cloud formations appeared. The gods in these tales weren't just characters, they were mnemonic devices, celestial markers. In ancient Greece, Homer's Odyssey is often read as allegory or epic fiction. But beneath the surface of monsters and sea storms lies something else, a navigational template. The journey from Troy to Ithaca, though fantastical, follows a rough arc along the Mediterranean, mirroring real trade and travel routes. Scholars have speculated that portions of the poem encode geographic knowledge of islands, coastlines, dangerous shallows, and safe harbors. In a world where only the elite could read, and where maps were often unreliable or symbolic, an epic could serve as a traveler's manual. The poet became a pilot. In the Norse world, the Eddas and skaldic poems also preserved directional knowledge. Fjords, burial mounds, and glacial paths were often mentioned in kennings, poetic compounds that doubled as geographic markers: whale road for sea, bloodstone for battlefield. These weren't just flourishes of art. They were mnemonic anchors in a mental geography. Even early Indian epics like the Ramayana are laced with topographical memory. The journey of Rama across forests, rivers, and mountain ranges maps loosely onto real South Asian geography. Villages and pilgrims to this day follow his route, not through GPS, but through sung tradition. The tale is recited not just for devotion, but for orientation. But how did this work in practice? Picture a father teaching his son a poem. The son listens, not just for story, but for clues. The mention of a tree where the sun hits first, a river that hums against black stones, a cave shaped like a sleeping ox. These are not metaphors. They are coordinates. Repeated night after night, the poem becomes a mental trail, a song walk, one that can be followed long after the storyteller is gone, one that can guide the living to water, shelter, or ritual sites that no one else remembers how to reach. In cultures where oral tradition was the sole record-keeping device, this method had powerful advantages. Songs were easy to pass down. Their rhythm made them hard to forget. And unlike maps, they traveled with the body, inside the breath, inside the bones. A sung epic could survive flood, fire, exile. It could pass through the throat of a refugee and still carry the shape of a lost homeland. But there was also danger. If a line was forgotten, a landmark misremembered, a sacred path could vanish forever. That's why such poems were guarded fiercely. Some were only recited at certain times of year, during specific rites. Others required apprenticeship, often lasting decades. The knowledge wasn't just inherited, it was earned. To recite the poem incorrectly wasn't just an error, it was a distortion of reality itself. As writing spread and cartography evolved, this deeply embedded function of epic poetry began to fade. Stories became more literary, less lived, but echoes remain. In folk tales that always begin towards the east, past 3 rivers, in lullabies that mention mountains no one has seen in centuries. The structure is still there, only the memory has dimmed. So the next time you hear an ancient tale, ask yourself, what if it's more than story? What if the hero's path is a trail you could still walk? What if the god in the sky is a star you could still sail by? And what if, buried beneath centuries of retelling, lies a map, sung, not drawn, leading to a real place, a real turn, a real spring that still waits in silence? The ancients didn't forget where they came from. They sang it. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the way home. Sailors used star positions and constellations to cross oceans. He stood barefoot on the deck, the wind salted and sharp, eyes fixed not on the sea, but on the stars. The ocean stretched into blackness, a vast and heaving nothing, yet he walked it as though it had roads, not by compass, not by map, but by memory, by rhythm, by constellations that whispered roots into the darkness. Above him, the stars weren't just distant lights, they were instructions, stories, waypoints. He knew when to turn by the rising of Orion, when to stop by the tilt of the Southern Cross, and if clouds covered the sky, he waited, because without the stars, he was blind. Long before the West claimed mastery over the seas with metal tools and printed charts, ancient sailors from Polynesia, Arabia, Greece, and beyond had already mastered the art of crossing oceans using only the night sky. To them, navigation wasn't science. It was song, ancestry, and survival stitched into the stars. The Polynesians were perhaps the greatest of these ancient starwalkers. Over 3,000 years ago, they traversed thousands of miles across the Pacific, from island to island, in double-hulled canoes with no sails as we know them, no written records, and no magnetic compasses. What they did have was a mental map of the sky, an intimate sacred knowledge passed down through chants and oral teachings called Kalai Hoku, the wayfinding stars. The night sky to them wasn't random. It was a living ocean above the ocean. Each constellation rose and fell at predictable angles, tied to the seasons and the positions of specific islands. They memorized where each star set on the horizon, turning that invisible knowledge into visible direction. Key among these was the Southern Cross. For Southern Hemisphere voyagers, it functioned much like Polaris did for the North, an anchor in the sky, pointing steadily toward the celestial south. When the cross stood vertical above the ocean's edge, the sailor knew they were headed due south. When it tilted, they adjusted. This wasn't simple stargazing. It was course correction in real time. The stars guided not just direction, but timing, weather, and risk. In the Northern Hemisphere, Greek and Arab sailors relied on Polaris, the North Star, fixed nearly perfectly above Earth's axis. To a Mediterranean sailor, it was the only true constant. As the ship drifted through moonlit waves, Polaris never moved. The closer it appeared to the horizon, the further south they had gone. The higher it rose, the further north they had returned. Ancient Greek texts, including those of Homer and later Ptolemy, refer to the stars not as myths alone, but as navigational beacons. Even Odysseus, legendary sailor of Homer's epics, is told by a goddess to keep the bear on his left, referring to the constellation Ursa Major as he sails home. Arab navigators during the Golden Age of Islamic astronomy took these traditions further. Between the 8th and 15th centuries, sailors across the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea perfected celestial navigation using complex star tables, tools like the kamal, a simple wooden card held at arm's length, and a deep knowledge of the night sky. The kamal helped sailors measure the angle of a star above the horizon, usually Polaris, to determine latitude. These were not large, complex machines. They were elegant, intuitive, and designed for use under starlight and wind. But what made ancient celestial navigation so profound was that it wasn't just about direction. It was about relationship. To navigate by stars was to see yourself as part of a vast moving system where every constellation, every moon phase, every tilt of the sky was a conversation. Polynesian navigators used not only the stars, but the moon's phases, the color of the water, the behavior of birds, the direction of swells. They didn't merely look at the stars. They traveled through them. Imagine a voyage of weeks with no land in sight, no instruments but memory. The only things visible at night were the stars and the dark, and still, these sailors could name each point of light, trace its course, and know which island lay beneath it. They spoke the names of stars like ancestors. Each had a purpose, a path, a place. To lose that knowledge was more than losing navigation. It was losing heritage. That's why many star navigators trained for years under masters, learning to recite entire star maps by heart. In Polynesia, a wayfinder had to memorize not just which stars rose where, but at what angle, on what day, in what season. They learned how the stars danced differently across hemispheres, how certain stars opened and closed the sky for travel. This ancient system nearly vanished under colonialism. Missionaries and Western explorers dismissed oral navigation as primitive. Star paths were forgotten. But in recent decades, a cultural revival has returned that knowledge to its people. The voyages of the Hokulea, a modern Polynesian canoe, proved that with no instruments, just the stars, crews could still travel thousands of miles between islands with near-perfect accuracy. So when we think of navigation today, we picture GPS satellites and digital screens. But beneath all of that, beneath every compass, every map, is the echo of a man on a boat, staring upward into darkness, reading the sky like scripture. Each star a word, each constellation a sentence, and together a language that carried civilizations across the edge of the world. People followed animal migration routes. In the vast and unforgiving landscapes of the ancient world, where maps were drawn in memory, not ink, and survival hung on the edge of instinct, there were no road signs, no compasses, no reliable guides. But there were patterns, ancient rhythms carved into the earth by hooves, wings, and fins. And for many early peoples, it was not the stars or the sun that led them across the land, but the quiet, relentless migrations of animals. To modern eyes, migration is a marvel of biology. Birds vanish southward, salmon leap upstream, caribou thunder across the tundra. But to ancient humans, especially those living in harsh or shifting climates, these movements were lifelines. Where the herds went, so did the water. Where the birds landed, so did the fruit. Where the fish returned, so did the season. And so, long before empires, borders, or even spoken language, people watched, learned, followed. In regions like the Eurasian steppes, early nomadic tribes patterned entire seasonal cycles around the migration of deer, elk, and wild horses, not just for meat, but for everything: hides, bone tools, sinew, ritual items. They learned where the herds stopped to drink, where they calved, where predators gathered. This wasn't just hunting, it was navigation, a living calendar encoded in movement. Further north, in Arctic and subarctic zones, indigenous groups like the Sami in Europe or the Inuit in North America followed the paths of reindeer and caribou across frozen expanses. They knew the exact weeks when herds would cross rivers or converge on high plateaus. Temporary camps sprang up not at random, but where migration would funnel abundance directly past their dwellings. To miss the migration was to risk starvation. Along coastal regions, people timed their movements to the return of spawning fish, salmon in the Pacific Northwest, sturgeon in Eastern Europe. When the rivers boiled with silver bodies, entire communities shifted to the banks. Smokehouses were built, salt gathered, songs were sung. The fish didn't just feed the people, they told them when to gather, when to leave, when to prepare for scarcity. Fish were clocks with gills. Even birds, seemingly the most elusive of creatures, served as aerial prophets. Flocks of cranes, swans, or geese flying overhead signaled shifts in season. People who lived near marshes or wetlands, like the marsh dwellers of Mesopotamia or the river tribes of the Nile, watched closely. If birds arrived early or late, it might mean drought, flood, or an omen from the gods. In Egypt, the annual arrival of certain birds coincided almost exactly with the Nile's flooding, a literal lifeline that replenished the soil. Watching the sky became part of agriculture, religion, and state policy. But this wasn't passive observation. People began to integrate these animal routes into their own. Trade caravans moved along antelope trails. Pilgrimages followed bird paths toward sacred lakes. Refugees from drought or war used the same invisible highways the herds had carved over generations. The animals had already scouted the safest terrain, the shallowest crossings, the richest oases. All humans had to do was follow. Some of the oldest roads in the world, now buried beneath asphalt or obscured by cities, trace these same ancient paths. Even the famed Silk Road, often thought of as a purely commercial invention, aligns in part with older animal migration and nomadic patterns stretching from the Mongolian steppes to the Levant. Long before merchants moved silk, animals moved water, and humans moved in their shadow. These routes weren't just practical, they became spiritual. In many cultures, animal migrations were seen as divine rituals. The animals weren't just surviving, they were performing cosmic duties. To follow them was to stay in harmony with nature's law. Shamans in Siberia, North America, and Central Asia often journeyed with the herds, interpreting their movements as messages from spirits or ancestors. Some tribes refused to hunt certain animals during specific stages of migration, believing the herd itself was a living being that must not be angered. And what's most astonishing, these practices lasted. For thousands of years, long into recorded history, long after cities rose and fell, many people still structured their lives around animal rhythms. Even today, in isolated parts of the world, traditional herders and foragers still read the land not through data, but through tracks, droppings, molting feathers, and the angle of a migrating sunbird. In a world where we now build roads across every surface and light the sky with artificial stars, it's easy to forget this. But once, the road to survival wasn't paved. It was tracked, winged, and scaled. It shimmered across water, rumbled over plains, and vanished into mountain passes. And those who followed it didn't just chase food. They chased knowledge. They followed the original paths of time. And in their footsteps, the first maps were drawn, not on parchment, but in memory, muscle, and trust. Villagers marked trails with piled stones and broken branches. Before maps, before compasses, before ink ever traced the shape of a forest path or a winding valley, there were stones, broken branches, burned stumps, bent trees, things that didn't belong to the wilderness, but were placed there deliberately, quietly, often in fear, and often with reverence. Trail markers made not for trade routes or armies, but for survival, by villagers who needed to find their way back home, or to warn others not to. To us, a stack of stones might mean nothing. A snapped branch might seem random. But in many ancient and medieval villages, these were signs as clear as any written word. Because when a forest could swallow a person in moments, when paths were dirt, light was scarce, and wolves still followed footsteps. These simple, almost invisible markers were the only language that mattered. Some of these markers lasted generations. A pile of 3 stones, placed at a specific bend, might signal safety. A 4th stone added? Danger ahead. A scorched tree trunk, perhaps a lightning-blasted stump kept unnaturally blackened, might mean, do not sleep here. In the Balkans, bent saplings tied in knots were used to guide herders back through mountain passes hidden by snow. In the Scottish Highlands, a stack of flat stones marked the last point of safe passage before a bog began. In northern Africa, a single rock placed upright atop a flat boulder pointed toward hidden wells across the desert. And none of it was written down. Not formally. These were folk maps, etched into terrain through repetition, story, and superstition. A father told his son, A midwife told her apprentice. A shepherd memorized the markers by moonlight. They weren't just guides. They were memory, frozen in stone and branch. In early Germanic regions, certain crossroads were marked not with signs, but with bone trees, old, gnarled limbs where animal skulls were nailed to mark burial paths or cursed woods. In Eastern Europe, hollow logs were left upright as boundary markers, guarding paths that were said to belong to something else after nightfall. These weren't decorations. They were warnings, a kind of spiritual GPS, if you knew how to read it. Even in parts of ancient Rome and pre-Roman Gaul, travelers and locals marked sacred groves and hidden trails with piles of pebbles called cairns. These often grew with each passerby, who would add a stone to honor a god or a spirit, or simply to say, "I was here, and I lived." To disturb them without reason was said to bring misfortune. The land, in many beliefs, could be offended, and markers weren't just waypoints, they were offerings. In the Japanese mountains, travelers marked dangerous turns with Jizo statues or small stacks of rocks representing lost souls. In the Andes, pilgrims stacked stones at high-altitude passes to appease the mountain spirits. In the Arctic, Inuit travelers used inuksuk, stone formations shaped like people, to mark migration routes. These were not just navigation aids. They were echoes of presence. Each one said, "Someone came before you. Someone made it. You might too." But these trails were also acts of resistance. In colonized regions or places under foreign occupation, villagers kept hidden paths only they understood. In medieval Ireland, rebels marked escape routes through woods with forked branches wedged into stone walls. In Poland, Jewish communities during times of persecution created secret paths to water sources or meeting spots, marked with cryptic symbols scratched into fence posts or stones that only the initiated could decode. The brilliance of these systems lay in their invisibility. To outsiders, they were just landscape. To locals, they were survival. There were stories of armies lost for days in forests because they didn't know how to read the path markers just under their noses. Stones that didn't fit the terrain, branches bent the wrong way, bark scraped on the inside curve of a tree instead of the outside. And the beauty of it was that these markers could be read in silence. No voice, no signal, just a flick of the eye, a note in the brain. "We've gone too far. Turn here. Don't stop." In war, in plague, in migration, in fear. These were the maps the voiceless used. But what's most haunting is how long they lasted. In some alpine villages, shepherd routes passed down for 500 years were still navigated by stone markers placed by ancestors who never wrote a word. In certain African communities, broken branch formations led to sacred groves untouched by colonial mapping. In Siberia, reindeer herders still followed stone stacks hidden along tundra ridges, many of which predate the Russian Empire itself. These weren't just directions. They were stories made physical. Every pile of stones meant someone had been there before. Someone had worried about someone else getting lost. Someone wanted the next soul to make it through. And when you start to see the world that way, even the smallest disruption in a tree line can feel like a whisper from the past. And yet, as roads came, and borders hardened, and the written word pushed its way into every map and wall, many of these ancient roots were forgotten. Trees grew back. Stones scattered. The language of branch and rock began to fade. But not entirely. Because in quiet corners, you can still find them. A strangely bent tree near a stream. A pattern of rocks too precise to be accidental. A blackened stump in the middle of a clearing where no fire should have burned. And you wonder, was this a path? Was someone trying to say something? In a world now mapped by satellites and screens, It's easy to forget that for most of human history, we navigated by signs that couldn't speak. We trusted the land, not to guide us, but to remember for us. The land remembered the danger. It remembered the shortcuts. It remembered the people who left just enough of themselves behind that someone else might find the way forward. And maybe, just maybe, we should still be listening. Winds and smells were used to detect coastlines. The horizon was empty. No towers, no peaks, no sails. Just water. Endless sunlit water. But the navigator stood still, eyes half closed, nostrils flaring. He wasn't looking. He was smelling, listening, feeling the breath of the world. And then, without a word, he pointed east. Land. No compass. No charts. No landmarks. Just the invisible signs written in wind and salt. This is what ancient mariners knew, what modern instruments have long since forgotten. That the ocean speaks, that the air carries whispers, and that land, long before it rises into view, announces itself. To those who knew how to listen. Long before sextants or satellites, mariners, especially in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and along the Mediterranean, learned to detect coastlines not by sight, but by sensation. They understood that land didn't begin at the shore. It began in the sky, in the water, in the air itself. As ships approached unseen coasts, the rhythm of waves shifted. Swells flattened. The chaotic pulse of open ocean softened as it met the reflection of the seabed. Polynesian navigators knew this intimately. They memorized wave fingerprints, how swells rebounded off islands far beyond the visible range. Sitting in the hulls of their canoes, they felt these signatures through the movement of the craft. They could tell the direction and even the shape of approaching land by the rhythm beneath their feet. But even before the water changed, the air changed. It smelled different. Land, especially lush land, releases scent. Vegetation emits oils. Flowers bloom with volatile perfumes. Soil, when warmed, breathes. And in humid regions, these particles cling to the air and are carried by wind far out to sea. A sudden trace of sweetness, earthiness, the faint breath of green. Ancient sailors knew to watch for this moment. Arab navigators crossing the Arabian Sea documented how the scent of myrrh, frankincense, or spices could signal proximity to the Horn of Africa. In the Pacific, voyagers could detect an island by the smell of blossoms carried on the morning breeze. And in Homeric Greece, Odysseus's return was not marked by a landmark, but by the smell of the land he had lost. These observations weren't mystical. They were empirical, passed down orally, refined through repetition, and remembered through stories. A sailor might be taught, when the breeze turns warm and tastes like soil, turn north. The island is close. Or, if you smell flowers before dawn, the reef lies just beyond. Even birds gave warning. Seabirds like frigates, terns, or noddies rarely flew far from shore unless nesting. Their behavior changed with distance. Watching their flight paths, their altitude, direction, and time of return acted as a living compass. In Micronesian sailing tradition, navigators tracked specific birds by name, knowing which ones roamed furthest and which always returned before nightfall. A flock flying low at dusk often meant they were circling land. Chinese navigators in the Han Dynasty wrote of land birds appearing after the third moon, a signal that islands lay within days' reach. In Norse sagas, ravens were released to find Greenland, their return or absence serving as a direction. The smell of land, too, changed with time and tide. At night, cooler temperatures pressed scent down, spreading it across the sea's surface. At sunrise, as the land warmed, the smell intensified briefly, before being pulled upward into the sky by convection. So the best time to detect land by scent was often the fragile hour before dawn. In this way, the unseen world became a chart, not in lines, but in patterns. Ancient sailors layered these cues like instruments in a symphony. They watched the color of water. Paler greens meant shoals or reefs. They read cloud shapes. Stationary clouds often formed above islands due to moisture rising from trees and terrain. They listened for echoes, waves crashing differently where coastlines lurked. And they breathed, slowly, deliberately, waiting for the moment the sea tasted different. And sometimes, it saved their lives. In stormy seas, when visibility collapsed, these invisible signals were the only warning. A subtle flattening of the waves. A single petrel flying east. A sharp shift in scent, from sterile salt to the suggestion of earth. That was the difference between grounding on rocks or slipping safely into a hidden cove. In a world where mistakes meant death, the body became the instrument. Eyes weren't always enough, but the skin, the ears, the nose, they never stopped listening. Today, these skills are nearly gone. Modern ships rely on machines, radar, GPS, sonar. But once the ocean was read like a living manuscript, every sound a letter, every breeze a line. There are still elders, on islands in Vanuatu, on coasts in Oman, in small harbors of the Philippines, who remember, who can still taste the wind and say, "There is land. 3 hours. That way." And they are almost always right, because the ocean doesn't keep secrets. It murmurs them, always, to those who've learned how to hear, and for those ancient mariners who had no charts, no maps, and no second chances, the world was not divided between land and sea. It was only divided between those who listened and those who didn't. Pathfinding was passed down through oral generations. He crouched at the edge of the ridgeline, eyes scanning the valley below, not with fear, but memory. His feet knew this terrain long before his mind calculated it. The slope, the color of the rocks, the bend of the trees in the wind, these weren't simply features of the landscape. They were verses of an unwritten song, echoes of a path passed down not through maps or scrolls, but from voice to ear, from elder to child, over generations. This was not navigation in the modern sense. It was something older, deeper. It was pathfinding as inheritance. In a world before printed maps, before GPS or topographical databases, the difference between survival and disaster depended on one thing: knowing the land. And that knowledge didn't reside in paper or monuments. It lived in stories. It moved through chants. It was whispered over fires, demonstrated through footsteps, reinforced through ritual. It was oral knowledge, woven into the breath of every generation, and it was as sacred as it was practical. Trade routes, migration paths, water sources, seasonal hazards, sacred detours, none of this was guessed. None of it was discovered each time. It was remembered, recited, reenacted. The youngest child walked behind the elder, learning by watching which stones they stepped on, which way they leaned in the wind, how they read the birds' behavior. But alongside those movements came stories. A tale of a trickster god turning left at a rock that still bore a crack from lightning. A ghost who cursed anyone who crossed a canyon after dark. A love story that could only be told while walking toward the North Star. These stories weren't distractions. They were embedded coordinates. Among the Sand people of the Kalahari, pathfinding is taught through trails of experience, not explanation. A child learns to read footprints, plant blooms, insect sounds, not in a lecture, but through continuous movement alongside those who already know. If a trail floods in the rainy season, the child isn't told the alternate route. He walks it, feels it, lives it. And because no paper exists to confirm the knowledge, the only safeguard against loss is repetition. The story must be retold. The journey must be relived, over and over again. In the Andes, Inca runners, chasqui, carried messages across vast mountainous terrain without formal maps. But their pathfinding skill wasn't simply about stamina. It came from inherited knowledge. Tales about which ravines had the best echo if you were lost, which passes grew poisonous berries mistaken for food, which valleys carried wind strong enough to signal the coming of a storm 3 days early. These weren't facts in isolation. They were wrapped in legend, myth, practical advice hidden inside sacred narrative. In the Arctic, Inuit elders train younger generations to read ice memory. No written guide can track the chaotic shifting of ice flows, but through years of oral transmission, tales of the singing crack, or a place where the seal will stop coming if the ice is wrong, the paths become known. Navigation becomes not a system of coordinates, but a dance between awareness and ancestral whisper. This wasn't unique to remote tribes or isolated groups. Even in the Roman Empire, local guides were employed not for their knowledge of distances, but for their memory of the land. Mountain passes, weather shifts, enemy hiding spots, all encoded in personal and communal experience. And often, those guides came from oral cultures, people with no formal education, but perfect recall of terrain thanks to years of storytelling and pathwalking. In medieval Europe, travelers followed pilgrim routes not through signage, but songs. Verses would describe, in poetic form, when to expect a forest clearing, where a dangerous bend hid bandits, or which stream healed if you drank before dawn. Monks who couldn't read the stars knew which tree cast the longest shadow at noon on a specific day. And those details, passed from brother to brother, became a map of the divine. What's most striking is how this knowledge was maintained. It wasn't preserved in stone. It was preserved in people. And when a storyteller died without a student, a road disappeared. When a grandmother passed away without teaching her grandchild which hill became impassable in spring, a danger was reborn. This is why oral cultures held elders with reverence. They weren't just family. They were living archives. Losing one was like losing a library. Modern anthropology confirms this in tragic ways. As indigenous languages vanish, so too does their pathfinding. A chant that once detailed the safe tide crossing between islands is gone forever. A story that warned of seasonal flooding, forgotten. The landscape remembers, but people no longer understand the cues. And yet, in some places, this knowledge endures. A Polynesian navigator can still find a speck of land in the open ocean by reading cloud shapes and bird flight. A Bedouin can cross endless dunes by watching how sand shifts around his camel's feet. An Amazonian hunter knows the jungle not by direction, but by rhythm, scent, song. These are not tricks, they are inheritance. So when we speak of pathfinding, we must remember, it was never just about reaching a place. It was about carrying memory forward. It was about walking with the voices of your ancestors at your back, and the land itself speaking beneath your feet. To find your way was to remember your story, and to forget your story was to be truly lost. Celestial navigation involved measuring sun shadows. He knelt beside a stick in the sand, not a weapon, not a tool, but a guidepost. Around him, the wind hissed across the dunes, and the sun glared like an unblinking eye in a white-hot sky. There were no landmarks, no roads, no signs, only the shadow. Thin, shifting, stretching across the ground like a silent whisper from the heavens. He waited, watched, and marked its movement. Not with clocks, not with maps, but with memory, with rhythm, with light. This was celestial navigation by shadow, an ancient science of survival written in light and time. Long before magnetic compasses spread through Europe, and centuries before portable timekeeping existed, travelers had already mastered the art of orienting themselves by the sun. To them, the earth wasn't blank, and the sky wasn't distant. It was an active clock, constantly measuring movement. And the key to unlocking it lay in something simple: shadows. The concept was both elegant and astonishing. By planting a stick, called a gnomon, vertically into the earth and watching the length and angle of its shadow, ancient navigators and desert travelers could estimate both direction and time of day. The shortest shadow always occurred when the sun reached its highest point, solar noon. At that moment, the sun would be due south in the northern hemisphere and due north in the southern hemisphere. Once you knew where noon was, you knew where you were. The method was refined across cultures, particularly in arid and open regions where directional cues were scarce. Arab caravans crossing the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert routinely used shadow measuring techniques, watching how the sun cast light across camel lines and dunes. The direction of the shadow in early morning and late afternoon gave crucial information. Long morning shadows pointed west, evening shadows pointed east. Travelers could orient themselves with remarkable precision, using nothing more than the light of the sun and the movement of its cast. The Greeks developed this method into mathematics. Around the 3rd century BCE, the scholar Eratosthenes used the difference in shadow lengths at different locations in Egypt to calculate the Earth's circumference with uncanny accuracy. By comparing the shadow of a vertical stick in Siene, modern-day Aswan, to one in Alexandria at the same time of day, he deduced the curvature of the Earth. But while philosophers measured for theory, travelers measured for life. Knowing how much time remained before sunset could mean reaching an oasis or shelter before dark, or dying before morning. In India and China, temple architects designed massive sundials based on similar principles. These were not only to mark the hours of the day, but also to align sacred structures to cardinal points. The length of a person's shadow could tell priests when to begin ceremonies, or when to stop travelers from continuing into dangerous hours. In Europe, shadow tools evolved. The shadow square, a feature of early astrolabes and quadrants, allowed users to determine height or distance by shadow angle. Mariners in the Mediterranean learned to estimate latitude by the sun's height at noon, casting shadows against the ship's mast and timing their angles. Even the Vikings, long assumed to have relied only on stars, are now believed to have used sunstones and shadow boards to navigate when the sky was overcast or the sun low on the horizon. A short stick atop a dial, a simple solskuggafjol or shadow board, gave direction at sea without any compass. To use a shadow for navigation wasn't a matter of guesswork. It was empirical, reliable, a practice honed over generations of observation. Each morning, a traveler could trace the path of light, mark where the shadow landed hour by hour, and carry that internal compass across vast terrain. By knowing how far the shadow moved in a fixed time, one could estimate travel speed, direction drift, and even predict storm delays based on changing sun patterns. But there was also something spiritual in it. For many, the sun wasn't just a guide. It was a deity. The shadow was the god's finger, pointing the way. In ancient Egypt, Ra's passage across the sky marked the rhythm of the world, and shadow measurement became embedded in the architectural precision of pyramids and tombs. To follow the shadow was to follow divine instruction. The practice faded only with the rise of more advanced tools, compasses, sextants, chronometers, but its memory survives in architecture, ritual, and even language. We still speak of someone casting a long shadow, or moments slipping into the shadow of night. These aren't just metaphors. They're echoes of a time when shadows told us where we were and where we were going. Imagine standing in the middle of nowhere, without signal, without satellites, without timepieces, and using nothing but a stick and sunlight to find your way. That wasn't mythology. That was survival. That was knowledge passed from father to son, from nomad to sailor, encoded in shadow and sand. So the next time you watch your shadow stretch across the ground, remember, it's not just a shape. It's a compass, a clock, a relic of the oldest form of navigation we've ever known. And for thousands of years, it was enough. River currents and flow direction served as natural compasses. In a time before compasses swung on needles, before roads carved certainty into the landscape, and long before the stars were charted with mathematical precision, humans looked to something more immediate, more earthly, and ever-moving. The rivers. To the ancient traveler, merchant, soldier, or storyteller, a river was not just water. It was direction, a guide, a memory made liquid. Its current didn't just carry boats, it carried orientation. And for countless civilizations, the flow of a river was the first compass. Rivers carved themselves into the consciousness of early people because they moved with such relentless consistency. The Nile flowed north. The Tigris and Euphrates ran southeast. The Danube sliced across Europe from west to east. In regions without mountains or coastlines to guide the eye, the direction of a river became the backbone of geographic logic. Ask an ancient villager where another settlement lay, and they wouldn't say east or west. They'd say upstream or downstream. And those terms meant more than location. They meant relationships. Who had control of water? Who was closer to sacred springs? Who was farther from flood zones? Upstream communities were often seen as older, closer to the river's source, more noble. Downstream ones might be viewed as younger, or even as less pure, receiving the river after it had passed through many hands and many uses. In this way, the river became a social compass, not just a geographic one. In ancient Egypt, for example, orientation was built entirely around the Nile's flow. Upper Egypt refers to the southern stretch of the country because it lies upstream. Lower Egypt, despite being to the north, lies where the Nile pours into the Mediterranean. This logic was embedded in everything: trade, governance, religion. Pharaohs built their tombs on the western bank of the Nile, believing the sun set there into the underworld. The east bank, where the sun rose, was for the living. Even the direction of temple entrances was aligned to the rhythm of river and sun. For traveling merchants, the river current was literal movement and metaphor. Moving downstream meant speed. Goods could be delivered quickly. Grain shipments rushed to a starving city. Soldiers ferried to suppress rebellion. Moving upstream was slower, laborious, and often required towing by rope or pole. But it also meant return, progress, resupply, survival. Every bend in the river was a decision point, every eddy a memory. In Mesopotamia, where the flat, featureless plains between the Tigris and Euphrates offered few natural landmarks, knowing the current's direction could orient entire expeditions. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Akkad positioned themselves based on these flows, knowing not only who lay upstream, but how power moved. A king who controlled the upstream city could threaten water access to those below. To be downstream was to be dependent. Further east, in the Indus Valley, the great Sarasvati and Ghaggar-Hakra rivers, some now vanished, served as spiritual and practical anchors. Ancient Indian texts speak of rivers as mothers, creators, judges. To move along them was to move through layers of cosmic order. Orientation wasn't just navigation, it was sacred geography. Even the ancient Chinese used river flow in their concepts of harmony and order. The Yellow River, Huanghe, and Yangtze were not just routes, they were axes of civilization. Towns were described in terms of their relationship to the river's flow. Directions like Jiangbei and Jiangnan still exist today, meaning north of the river and south of the river, rooted in the original current-based understanding of the land. And it wasn't just in mighty civilizations. In forested or desert regions where the land was hostile or shifting, like among early African, Amazonian, or Australian peoples, rivers were living maps. Tribes used water flow not just to travel, but to orient language. Words for east might mean toward sunrise along the river. West might be toward the setting sun against the current. These weren't abstract concepts. They were bodily. You felt direction by feeling resistance in your canoe. You knew home by the way the water moved under your hands. This dependence on rivers for orientation even shaped how early stories were told. Epics like the Odyssey or the Mahabharata are deeply entangled with water. Heroes returning home by river, gods appearing near estuaries, wars fought for river access. In these tales, direction was never an abstract compass rose. It was always framed by water, where it bends, where it forks, where it vanishes. As compasses came into use and maps grew more precise, rivers slowly lost their central place in how humans thought about direction. But echoes remain. We still say we're going upstream in life, fighting the current, or drifting downstream when we surrender. Old cities are still labeled by their riverbanks, and many human migrations, ancient roads, and even modern highways still follow old water paths. So if you ever stand beside a river and feel that strange urge to follow it, not because you know where it leads, but because it feels like it remembers where everything began, you are stepping into an ancient instinct, one that predates writing, maps, and even memory. Because long before we looked to the stars, we followed the rivers, and they never let us forget which way was home. Sailors read the color of the sea and the shape of waves. Long before maps were drawn, before compasses swung, and long before longitude even had a name, there were sailors who crossed entire oceans without a single instrument. No sextant, no clock, just their eyes, their memory, and the sea itself. They didn't read charts. They read water. Across the vast Pacific and Indian Oceans, ancient sailors, especially Polynesian navigators, Tamil seafarers, and Arab dowsmen, learned to interpret the sea as a living language. It wasn't poetry. It was survival. These were men who could look at the color of the water and tell you how deep it was, who could judge the shape of a wave and know which island lay beyond the horizon, who could read the angle of foam left behind by wind and tell which current would carry them home. This wasn't mysticism. This was training, passed down through generations, father to son, master to apprentice. In Polynesia, these masters were known as wayfinders. They were more than sailors. They were human compasses. They memorized stars, yes, but by day, when the skies betrayed them, they turned to the ocean's surface for answers. The color of the sea changed constantly. Emerald over coral, indigo over deep trench, golden green near lagoons, milky blue where sand was stirred by tide. A single hue shift, just a gradient, told them they were nearing danger or safety. In the Marshall Islands, stick charts were made, not to record geography, but to map the way waves bent and curved around unseen islands. These were not drawings of land, but drawings of how the sea reacted to land. Wave refraction was everything. Even with no island in sight, Polynesian navigators knew where land was by how waves rebounded. One set of swells came from the east, but if another, subtler ripple crossed at a strange angle, that meant something had disrupted them. Maybe a reef, maybe a coast, maybe a place they'd been searching for over weeks of open ocean. In the Indian Ocean, Tamil and Malay sailors tracked the changing rhythm of monsoon winds, but also watched how foam moved near their hull. Was it tight and swirling? Shallow. Was it long and spread flat? Deep. They dipped hands in the water and felt its warmth change. Because water temperature meant proximity to currents, which meant drift, which meant they could tell if they were sliding north or west without seeing a single point of land. To modern eyes, this sounds impossible, but these were people who could close their eyes and feel the sea's pulse through the boat's timbers. They knew what a following swell felt like versus a cross current. They noticed when a swell came half a second earlier than it should, and they knew that meant the island they sought was no more than a day's sail away. There are stories of Polynesian wayfinders knowing when they were within 50 miles of land just by how seabirds flew, how high, how frequently they dipped. But it was the water that told them the most. The ocean was their map, and its slightest change was a whisper. Foam wasn't just a byproduct of wind, it was a text. Certain patterns indicated underwater obstacles, sandbars, or opposing currents. In the Bay of Bengal, sailors noted how different the sea sounded when the hull struck certain waves. A deeper thump meant long swell. A slap meant short, choppy water, signaling shallows ahead. Even rain was used. In parts of the Pacific, rain was seen not as obstruction, but opportunity. It flattened the sea and made underwater reefs visible through the lens of fresh water. A trained eye could look through a brief downpour and see death, or sanctuary, waiting below. And this wasn't ancient history alone. As late as the 20th century, some traditional navigators could still sail 2,000 miles without compass or chart. In 1976, the Hokulea, a Polynesian double-hulled canoe, retraced the journey from Hawaii to Tahiti using only these ancient methods, proving to the world what oral history had always said. They weren't lucky. They were masters of an art most of the world forgot. The colonizers who arrived later often called these sailors primitive. But how primitive is a man who can read the sea better than you can read a book? How lost are we really when we stare at GPS screens and still get turned around in cities someone else designed? These navigators didn't just move across water. They moved through memory. They memorized how waves wrapped around every island in their network, not as data points, but as feelings, as rhythms. Their minds weren't maps. They were oceans themselves. And they taught with silence. Apprentices weren't given charts. They were taken to see and told to feel, to close their eyes, to sense the difference between a regular swell and one that had passed over a reef 40 miles away. They learned not through speech, but through presence, through days, weeks, months at sea, where every drop of water was a teacher, and every mistake could cost your life. Today, the waves still move, the colors still shift, the foam still speaks, but fewer and fewer people are listening. The knowledge once passed from lip to ear in the cradle of salt and wind is fading. And yet, it's not gone. Because the ocean remembers. It still holds its language, waiting for someone willing to read it again. To look not at a map, but at the light on the water, the way the horizon bends, the way a wave touches the boat a half-second too soon. And in that moment, even in our age of satellites and screens, we glimpse what it meant to know the sea, not as a mystery, but as home. Wind patterns were memorized as seasonal travel guides. The sky never changed, but the wind did, and they remembered. Not with calendars, not with charts, but with the rhythm of air against their faces, with the dance of dust across dunes, with the lean of sails that could tear or save a life depending on the month. For traders and nomads of the ancient world, the wind was not a mystery. It was a map, a clock, a trusted voice that whispered when to move, when to wait, when to risk everything for the promise of a port, a caravan, or a crossing. Before empires built roads, before sailors drew stars into lines, there were the winds and the people who listened. In Arabia, Berber traders and Bedouin nomads studied the desert like a living creature. They didn't simply wander. They timed their crossings to the winds that swept across the sands. The Shamal in the north, the Khamsin in Egypt, the harmattan across West Africa, each with their own season, their own warning. These winds weren't background, they were survival. To travel during the wrong wind was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. A headwind in the Sahara could bury a caravan in sand, but a tailwind, perfectly timed, could carry it across 500 miles of open desert without stopping. So the elders remembered. They marked their journeys not by distance, but by breath. When the east wind rises and burns the camel's eyes, wait 3 days, they would say. Or, if the palm trees lean by morning, the journey west is open. These weren't proverbs, they were instructions. In the Indian Ocean, traders learned the monsoon cycle not by meteorology, but by memory. The monsoons were not storms. They were systems, massive, dependable flows of wind that reverse direction with the seasons. In summer, the southwest monsoon carried ships from Africa and Arabia toward India. In winter, the northeast monsoon carried them back. But to use them was not simple. You had to know when the winds would turn, not just which month, but which week. You had to memorize the smell of the air, the tilt of the clouds, the pressure on the skin. One day too late, and your ship could be caught in stillness or crushed by storms. Ancient sailors from Yemen, Gujarat, and the Swahili coast became masters of this dance. They set sail not by guesswork, but by wind books, oral traditions passed down like sacred chants. Fathers taught sons to recognize the smiling sky before the shift, or the sudden silence that came before a surge. A missed signal meant a lost voyage, or worse, and the knowledge spread. Roman merchants sailing to Egypt learned the Red Sea's seasonal wind reversals. Chinese navigators timing voyages to Java or Sri Lanka planned entire expeditions around changes in the trade winds. In the Pacific, Polynesian wayfinders didn't just read stars, they felt winds in their bones. Some could tell the arrival of distant land by how the wind shifted mid-voyage, growing warmer or more humid. Wind was more than weather. It was code, and those who knew how to read it could cross oceans long before the West ever dreamed of doing so. This knowledge wasn't written in books, it was carried in bodies. A navigator might recite the winds like a poem. When the sea hisses, but the sky is calm, wait. When the clouds travel low and the birds do not return, sail. Traders sang of the Samiel, the scorching devil wind of Mesopotamia, or the Levante that guided ships into the Mediterranean. Even in cold places, the wind became prophecy. Viking sailors tracked seasonal gusts along the coasts of Norway and Iceland. They knew that when the wind blew warm from the west too early, storms would follow. When it lingered cold into spring, the seas would be flat but treacherous. And perhaps most incredibly, these patterns weren't just used. They were trusted more than anything else. Maps could be wrong. Stars could be hidden by cloud. But the wind was always honest. If it whispered not to go, you stayed. If it called, you left everything. This is how salt routes were established, how spice routes crossed oceans, how silk moved from China to Persia to Rome. Not by force, but by timing. Whole economies rose and fell on whether a captain knew when the air would turn. Some modern historians now refer to this as seasonal cognition, the ability to anchor memory not just to location, but to time. And wind was the key. Wind was the cue that turned a landscape from hostile to navigable. And in that sense, the ancient traveler was not just moving through space, but through rhythm. Every gust was a beat, every season, a stanza, every journey, a song of return and risk. Today, we sail with satellites and forecast models, but once, the wind alone was enough. Enough to cross deserts, to escape famine, to find new worlds. Not because it was powerful, but because someone had listened, had remembered, had passed down the song of the shifting air. And so, long before science could name it, the wind became the first guide, the first whisper of direction in a world with no roads, the pulse beneath every journey. And those who heard it, they moved with the world, not against it. Birds were released to help find land. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, sky bleeding into sea, with no hint of shore. The sails strained against a salt-heavy wind, and every man on board could feel the weight of uncertainty closing in like fog. Water barrels were dwindling. The stars had not shone for 2 nights. Maps were useless this far from home, but high above the deck, in a small wooden cage lashed to the mast, something stirred, a low coo, the flutter of feathers. And then a decision was made. A sailor reached in, cupped the trembling creature in both hands, and released it into the wind. All eyes followed the bird. It flew upward, circled once, twice, and vanished toward the western sky. If it did not return, the message was clear. Land lay in that direction. If it circled and came back, wings shuddering from fatigue, then they were still hopelessly adrift, alone on a mirror of endless blue. This wasn't desperation. It was method. For thousands of years, long before compasses guided ships and sextants read the stars, sailors trusted birds to do what human senses could not: find land. And they did so not out of superstition, but out of deep empirical knowledge, passed down by generations of navigators who understood something profound. Birds know what we forget: how to come home. The technique was as simple as it was brilliant. Birds, especially species like pigeons or crows, will not fly indefinitely over open sea unless trained to do so. Their instinct is to return to land, to food, to roost. Sailors exploited this behavior. When the world dissolved into fog or waves, they released a bird into the sky. If it flew high and disappeared in a single direction, it meant land was near, close enough for its senses to lock on. But if it circled and returned, exhausted and confused, it meant there was nothing nearby. The ship was still alone. Ancient records confirm this practice across cultures. The most famous is from the saga of Eric the Red, where Norse sailors traveling to Iceland and Greenland released ravens. If the raven returned, there was no land. If it flew away and did not come back, it had found somewhere to land, and the ship would follow. The technique was so reliable that some Norse captains carried multiple birds, releasing them in different directions to triangulate the presence of islands in fog-choked waters. But the Norse were not the only ones. Ancient Phoenician traders are believed to have used doves, trained to return to coastal roosts, allowing them to gauge how far they'd drifted from known shores. Indian Ocean sailors, Maldivian and Arab, used seabirds to predict atolls and islands, watching their flight paths in the early morning light. Polynesian wayfinders, masters of open ocean navigation, watched frigate birds and terns with trained eyes. These birds rarely stray far from land, and their direction of flight during certain hours could reveal not only where land was, but how far and what kind. This was more than animal behavior. It was an early form of dynamic navigation, a fusion of biology, observation, and maritime knowledge that required patience and faith. The birds became messengers between the sea and the shore. They were not tools, they were partners. But there was risk. If a bird was released too early, it might vanish without returning, and still lead to nothing. If released too late, the ship might already be in danger. So captains weighed the choice carefully. Releasing a bird wasn't casual. It was sacred. A final hope before panic set in. There are accounts from later centuries, especially during the Age of Exploration, where desperate captains turned again to birds in times of crisis. Christopher Columbus, on his voyage across the Atlantic, noted birds flying near the ship as a sign of approaching land. On September 14, 1492, he recorded in his log, "The men saw a tropic bird and a tern, signs of land. They released birds of their own to test it, and followed the signs into the New World." Yet as navigation advanced, this practice slowly faded. The compass, the chronometer, and the printed map replaced the trembling hands holding feathers at sea. Birds became symbols, no longer instruments, but their legacy lingers in our myths, in our metaphors, and in the quiet recognition that, sometimes, our ancestors knew how to trust what we've forgotten. The image endures, a ship adrift, sky darkening, no land in sight. A single bird loosed into the wind, everyone watching, hearts pounding. The wings beat faster, lifting against the gust. It circles, hangs, then vanishes into the distant light. And for the first time in days, hope returns. Because long before satellites tracked the oceans, before charts named every reef, there was this moment, when a bird's wings pointed the way forward, and the ocean whispered back, "Land is near." Skilled guides were paid more than merchants. He didn't wear jewels. He carried no sword. And yet, when he entered the city gate, even the richest merchants stepped aside. Dust-covered, lean, with eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon, he was a guide. And in a world without maps, without milestones, and where the difference between a wrong turn and a right one was often death, his knowledge was worth more than coin. Because he didn't just know the land, he understood it. The wind, the stars, the silence of valleys, and the mood of mountains. He could lead caravans through deserts where no water flowed, across mountain passes where no tracks remained. And the merchants who paid him, fat with gold, spices, silk, knew that without him, none of it mattered. In many ancient societies, the most skilled guides were treated not as servants, but as guardians, keepers of invisible roads. They were paid more than artisans, more than soldiers, sometimes even more than the very merchants whose goods they protected. Why? Because knowing the way meant survival. In an age where a single misstep could lead an entire caravan to perish in a sandstorm, or where enemy territory could be only one unseen ridge away, a guide wasn't a luxury. He was the reason trade happened at all. Across the Silk Road, for example, guides were indispensable. The routes from Xi'an to Antioch passed through searing deserts, treacherous mountains, and the territories of countless tribal powers. Merchants carrying fortunes in jade, silk, and incense did not rely on luck. They relied on those who had walked the path before, men who knew which wells were poisoned, which tribes demanded tribute, which stars marked the safe passage through dunes. Some of these guides worked under oath, others charged extraordinary sums, and the most skilled were often given bonuses, protection, and seats of honor, not for status, but for necessity. Arabia was no different. The great trade routes that ran from Yemen through Mecca to Damascus depended entirely on navigators who knew the desert's breath. These rahala, or elite guides, could sense coming storms by reading the shape of clouds on the horizon. They judged time by the angle of sand shadows. They remembered not just where oases lay, but how deep the water sat that year. Some carried no map, but held the geography of entire empires in their heads. They were so valuable that rival merchant houses would pay to delay their competitors by buying a guide's loyalty. In the Roman Empire, when soldiers or traders pushed north into unfamiliar territories, they didn't rely on generals alone. They hired local guides, often paying them in gold or land. One Roman text advises merchants to bind the guide with loyalty, because, should he mislead you once, all coin is worthless. These men could make or break expeditions. Their betrayal could mean ambush. Their knowledge could mean escape. But perhaps nowhere was the value of a guide more culturally sacred than in West Africa. Along the trans-Saharan routes, connecting the gold-rich lands of Mali to North Africa and the Mediterranean, guides were often born into hereditary roles. Some Berber clans specialized for generations in desert navigation. They carried no metal, wore light cloth to blend with the heat, and used the stars, wind patterns, and even the song of shifting dunes to orient themselves. These men could walk blindfolded through terrain that would swallow armies. They were paid in weight, not in silver, but in salt and gold dust, carried by the traders who knew that without them, they'd vanish before the third day's sun. In Mesoamerican societies, elite guides known as tlamatinaime, literally knowers of things, accompanied emissaries and traders through jungle paths connecting vast city-states. Their skills combined geography, diplomacy, and mythology. A good guide didn't just know the path, he knew which deities presided over each terrain, which omens to heed, and how to avoid offending local spirits. These guides were often trained in temples, blending sacred knowledge with topography. Even in medieval Europe, when pilgrimage routes and merchant trails webbed across the continent, skilled guides could command huge sums. A lone traveler might pay more for a local guide to cross a mountain pass than for his lodging, meals, and horse combined. Why? Because wolves didn't negotiate, bandits didn't care about faith, and snow didn't listen to prayers. And so, across every continent, the pattern held. The guide was sacred. He might not speak much, he might not look important, but his knowledge was worth kingdoms. Empires rose because he showed them the way. Empires fell when he walked away. And what did these guides carry with them? Not gold, not weapons, but memory. Memory of the land, memory of danger, memory of where others died so the next might live. In their minds were maps that no ink could hold. In their silence, the weight of places too sacred to speak aloud. Today, we navigate with satellites, with glowing screens and digital voices, but that comfort, that ease, was built on the bones of those who walked without signs. The guides who stared into starless nights and still knew where they were, who remembered how shadows fall differently in winter, how tree moss lies on one side, how water smells before it appears. So when you walk a road and know where you're going, remember that someone long ago didn't. Someone had to go first, had to listen to the land, had to find the way, and someone else had to trust them enough to follow. That's why the guide was paid more than gold, because when death waits on every horizon, it is not the wealth you carry that matters. It's who knows how to bring you through it. Land paths were etched into oral trade route. Lore. Long before the age of printed maps, GPS satellites, or drawn borders, the world's most traveled roads were not written. They were remembered. Carved not into parchment, but into song, breath, and repetition. In the markets of Africa, across the burning plateaus of Arabia, through the jungles of Asia and the deserts of Persia, merchants and caravan leaders memorized entire geographies, not by symbols or scripts, but through oral trade lore, long rhythmic chains of place names, dangers, distances, and blessings passed down from mouth to ear, generation to generation. To survive the trade routes was not simply a matter of knowing the direction, it was a matter of knowing the story. And in these oral maps, the landscape came alive, not as abstract coordinates, but as living characters in a drama of risk, reward, and rhythm. Imagine a merchant standing on the edge of the Sahara, about to lead a caravan of camels through 1,000 miles of shimmering nothing. There are no signs, no water towers, just dunes and stars. And yet he knows. From Taghaza to Arawana is 3 days with salted air in the lungs. From Arawain to Timbuktu, the wind shifts and the vultures grow bold. He doesn't know this from reading. He knows it because someone whispered it to him as a child, and he repeated it, walking behind older men, until the desert itself seemed to speak it back. These oral maps weren't just practical, they were poetic. In parts of West Africa, griots, the traveling bards and historians, sang entire trade routes in verse. Each line encoded not only direction, but danger. From Djenné to Gao, the dust is sharp. Where the well is dry, the snake will watch. These mnemonic songs told the listener where water could be found, which village was friendly, where robbers waited, and how long a pack animal could walk before it collapsed. In Arabia, Bedouin tribes used similar poetic lists to navigate across the harsh Rub al-Khali and its surrounding territories. They would recite verses that named landmarks not by latitude, but by metaphor. The hill where the hawk flew thrice, or the black rock where the storm first wept. These weren't vague images, they were precise geographic code, refined by those who walked the land their entire lives. In the Indian subcontinent, especially during the rise of medieval spice and textile trade, merchants used couplets and verses in Sanskrit and Persian to encode shipping ports, overland stops, and pilgrimage sites. Some records describe oral lists of 300–400 stops along a single network, each remembered by its place in the rhyme. If a syllable was skipped, a direction could be lost. Memory was not optional. It was everything. Even in China, before detailed maps spread beyond the court, Silk Road traders relied on spoken routes that included rhymes about mountain passes, local prices, and bribe expectations. 5 li east of the Jade Spring, the wind forgets its name. Pay twice if the guard has a red tassel, or risk the loss of trade and fame. Lines like these weren't just art, they were survival manuals. What made oral trade lore so resilient was its adaptability. If a river dried up, a fort burned down, or a ruler imposed new taxes, the rhyme could shift overnight. Unlike maps, which had to be copied and distributed, a poem could be edited on the tongue and passed instantly. This made oral maps incredibly dynamic, able to capture local, temporary, even political knowledge that no parchment could contain. In places like Ethiopia, long-distance traders kept mental logs of entire highland to lowland journeys through chant. A market song might go, "Addis to Awash, the coffee darkens. Awash to Dyer, the goats grow lean. Dyer to Harar, beware the moonlit thieves." The pattern was as much for entertainment as encoding, and travelers would repeat it like a mantra as they walked, syncing breath to step, memory to movement. And these memories weren't isolated. They were shared, sometimes performed communally around fires or at caravanserais. Newcomers learned them like prayers. Veterans tested each other with riddles built into the path. Forgetting a verse wasn't just embarrassing, it could be fatal. Oral lore was the GPS of the ancient world, but it ran not on satellites, but on breath and trust. In the modern era, with maps now digitized and borders drawn by rulers rather than rhythms, much of this knowledge has faded, but echoes remain. Some indigenous and nomadic communities still pass knowledge of the land through song, and in academic archives, researchers are slowly recovering snippets, trade poems, travelers' riddles, marketplace chants, fragments of ancient geographies etched in voice. So when you imagine ancient trade routes, those spiderwebs of camel tracks, sandal prints, and wheel ruts that once stretched across continents, don't picture dusty maps or merchant scrolls. Picture a man walking beneath the stars, his lips moving in rhythm, whispering the names of hills and hazards like sacred beads. His direction is memory, his compass, verse, and each step he takes echoes with voices from centuries past, all telling him, "This is the way, seashells and knots." formed ancient navigation tools. Imagine standing at the edge of the sea with no compass, no map, no written language, only your mind, the stars, and a few pieces of string and shell. And yet, with that alone, you could sail across hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles of open ocean and arrive exactly where you meant to be, not by accident, but by design. Because some of the world's greatest navigators didn't need paper. They made the ocean legible with nothing more than seashells and knots. In the islands of Micronesia, scattered across the vast blue canvas of the Western Pacific, navigation wasn't a science locked in books. It was a sacred memory system, passed through generations. The most mysterious and powerful of these tools was the rebelib. A map, yes, but not in any sense we would recognize. Made from sticks, shells, and fibers, it wasn't carried on voyages. It was studied beforehand, memorized, internalized, and then left behind. These weren't maps of visual space. They were maps of movement. The curved sticks represented how swells moved between islands. The shells represented land, sometimes real islands, sometimes symbolic waypoints. Each knot or joint where string intersected wasn't a location, but a relationship, a signal, a rhythm. What direction a wave would bend around an island, how currents changed depending on the season, where to expect turbulence, where to expect silence. To the outsider, these shell maps looked chaotic, meaningless, but to the wayfinder, the traditional navigator, they were exact. They didn't show the shape of land, they showed how the sea responded to it. These were maps of invisible forces, and in many ways, they were more accurate than anything the West had created for centuries. The rebelib was just one kind. There were others. The meadow showed specific island clusters and the regular swell patterns between them. The matang was an abstract training tool, teaching young navigators how to understand how ocean swells curved and crossed, especially near land masses. All were constructed from the same materials: coconut midribs, senet cord, cowrie shells, or small pebbles. All were tactile. All were learned through touch, repetition, and time. Micronesian navigators didn't sail by sight. They sailed by sensation. They could feel the rise and fall of waves and know if land was over the horizon. They could detect multiple swell directions at once and understand which came from storms far away and which rebounded off reefs. The shell maps didn't tell them where they were. They reminded them how to listen. No ink, no numbers, no measurements, only movement. And the brilliance of the system was its adaptability. These maps didn't require updates. They didn't become obsolete. They modeled the permanent relationships between islands and the sea, and the way the Earth's motion, its winds, its tides, interacted with the fixed geography of the world. The ocean, they believed, wasn't chaos. It was rhythm, and rhythm could be learned. But here's the part that's most humbling. These navigators memorized dozens of islands, hundreds of sea behaviors, and they did it with no writing system, just knowledge passed orally, visually, physically. You didn't learn to navigate by reading. You learned by building your own shell map over and over, until your hands could make it without thought, until your body remembered what your eyes might forget. When Europeans first arrived in the Pacific, many dismissed these systems as crude or mystical. They couldn't understand how men in canoes, with no metal tools and no clocks, could cross distances European sailors feared. But in time, they realized the truth. They weren't surviving by luck. They were surviving by mastery. By a language of waves, stars, and memory the Western world had never bothered to learn. In fact, Western ships frequently got lost in the very waters Micronesian sailors navigated with ease. Some European captains even recorded being guided by locals who knew the position of islands hundreds of miles away just by watching the pattern of clouds or the angle of a swell. And yet, these navigation systems weren't shared freely. They were sacred, earned. You didn't become a wayfinder by privilege. You became one by patience, by years of watching the ocean, by building your maps again and again, by feeling every nuance of sea motion with your skin, your bones, your breath. It's easy to see these shell maps as relics, but they are more than that. They are reminders of how much the human mind can hold when trained with purpose, when memory isn't outsourced to paper, but carved into the self. And even today, some island communities keep the knowledge alive. In the Marshall Islands, a few elder navigators still teach the shell map systems, still build them by hand, not as museum pieces, but as living tools, because the ocean hasn't forgotten. It still moves with the same rhythms. It still sings the same songs. All it needs is someone who can read them. So, next time you think of a map, don't just imagine paper and ink. Imagine string tied in loops, shells clicked into place by moonlight, hands tracing lines not across land, but across water, wind, and time. Because once, long before satellites and sonar, a child sat beside an elder in a grass hut near the sea, and the elder laid out sticks, tied shells with twine, and said, "This is how the sea moves. This is how you find your way back." And that child would sail not by sight, but by soul. Inuksuks and standing stones marked sacred routes. It stood alone on the ridge, arms outstretched in stone, watching the ice and sky. No eyes, no mouth, just rough slabs stacked into the unmistakable shape of a human figure. Cold, silent, ancient. But it was not meant to be seen with the eyes alone. It was meant to be understood. For the Inuit and other indigenous Arctic peoples, this figure had a name: Inuksuk. To the outsider, it might look like a cairn, or a pile of rocks arranged by accident. But that's a mistake. Every stone, every angle, every arm and shadow was chosen with precision. Because this wasn't just a landmark, it was a message. In a landscape with no roads, no signs, no trees or rivers to break the monotony of white, Inuksut, plural for Inuksuk, became the language of survival. They were maps, warnings, guides, prayers. And in a world where a snowstorm could erase the horizon, where life and death could be decided by the direction of the next step, these standing stones became the oldest kind of sacred technology, memory fixed into earth. Inuksut marked where the ice was thin, where the caribou crossed, where the fish returned each season, where to turn to avoid a crevice, where to stop to wait out the wind, where someone had died. And sometimes, where the spirit world was watching. Some were tall and humanoid, called Inungwak, deliberately shaped like a person to say, "You are not alone." Others were smaller, just 2 or 3 stones high, but placed exactly in line with distant markers so that when you moved, they pointed towards safety. A fishing spot, a village, a pass through the mountains. They were not built at random. Each was a node in a vast, unwritten map of the Arctic, a network of markers stretching across the tundra and ice. And the knowledge of how to build, place, and read them was passed from elder to child, not in school, but in life. One might say, when you reach the twin Inuksut shaped like arms wide open, walk into the wind until the third sun shadow touches the mountain. Not poetry, not story, direction. There were Inuksut to warn, upright stones with sharp angles placed at cliffs or ice leads, gaps in the frozen sea. One misplaced step in those zones meant falling into freezing black water. The Inuksuk stood like a sentry. No words needed, just a shape against the sky. There were Inuksut to protect. Some were built in a circle, used during hunting to channel caribou into a trap. Others faced specific stars, used to time migrations or sacred rites. Some were built as memorials, marking the place where a loved one died or where a soul crossed into another realm. Each one was placed with care by hands that understood the land not as background, but as a living memory. And unlike roads or signs that fade, Inuksut endured. Some are hundreds, possibly thousands of years old, still standing, still pointing. In other parts of the world, standing stones carried similar purpose. In Scotland, Ireland, and Brittany, megalithic stones aligned with solstices and lunar patterns. In parts of Africa and Asia, stone stacks marked seasonal paths or burial sites. But the Arctic Inuksuk was different. It wasn't just a marker. It was a stand-in for presence, a human shape in a place where humans might vanish. In many Inuit traditions, to pass an Inuksuk was to speak to it, to thank it, or even to leave a stone, adding to its strength, its spirit. Because these were not dead rocks, they were watchers, witnesses. Today, modern highways run through parts of the north. GPS signals reach into frozen valleys, but the Inuksut remain, still used, still sacred. In some places, you'll see them beside modern trail markers, not replaced, but respected, because they hold something more than direction. They hold memory. They remind travelers that they walk paths made by ancestors, that every journey is layered with the footprints of those who came before. Fishermen, hunters, mothers, children, spirits, that the land is not blank, but written in stone, in silence. To build an Inuksuk is to leave a trace of your knowledge, your warning, your hope, a reminder to those who follow. Someone was here. Someone cared enough to guide you. And in a world as harsh and vast as the Arctic, that trace could mean life. So the next time you see one, on a ridge, on a glacier, at the edge of the sea, remember, it is not just a pile of stones. It is a voice, a whisper across time, saying, "This way. You're not lost. Keep going." The compass use was limited and often untrusted early on. He held it in his hand like it might bite him. The needle trembled within the shallow bowl, its point twitching toward a direction that offered no comfort. To his crew, hardened by years of watching stars and reading winds, it looked like a toy, a foreign object, a liar. They didn't trust it, not because it was broken, but because it was silent. It offered no story, no rhythm of the heavens, no call of seabirds, no scent of trees on the wind, just a mute insistence that north was that way. And so the captain tucked it away. Because in the earliest days of the compass, it wasn't a beacon. It was a threat, a challenge to centuries of tradition, and many chose not to listen. Though we often think of the magnetic compass as a turning point in navigation, its earliest history tells a different story, one of suspicion, limited use, and deep resistance. Invented in China during the Han Dynasty, the first compasses weren't even used for travel. They were tools of divination. Lodestone spoons, placed on bronze plates, rotated to align with the mysterious flow of the Earth's qi. These instruments were more mystical than practical, employed by geomancers to arrange buildings and graves, not ships. It wasn't until centuries later, during the Song Dynasty, that the Chinese began using magnetized needles floating on water for maritime orientation. Even then, they were used as supplements to traditional seafaring knowledge, not replacements. Chinese sailors still relied heavily on known currents, landmarks, monsoon winds, and celestial bodies. The compass was intriguing, but not sacred. When the knowledge of the compass began drifting west, likely via Islamic traders or through the Silk Road, it did not spark immediate revolution. In the Islamic world, scholars like Al-Ashraf and Ibn Majid wrote about the magnetized needle, but even they described it as an auxiliary tool, not a primary guide. It was useful when the stars were hidden, yes, but it was not trusted. And in medieval Europe, the suspicion ran deeper. Early references to compasses in the West appear in the 12th and 13th centuries, often shrouded in confusion. Descriptions include needles rubbed with mysterious stones, floating in bowls of water, turning as if by magic. Sailors whispered about it with a mixture of awe and dread. It worked, somehow, but it didn't feel right. It didn't move like the stars, didn't sing like the wind. It defied natural order. Some feared it was the work of sorcery, or the devil himself, leading men toward doom rather than salvation. So they clung to tradition. Celestial navigation remained dominant well into the 14th century. Mariners memorized the rise and fall of stars along the horizon, the phases of the moon, the color of the sea near shorelines. They followed cloud patterns, bird migrations, and even the flavor of the water. A compass needle couldn't tell you if a storm was coming. It couldn't tell you when to tack to catch a monsoon. It couldn't help you read the soul of the sea. And in that silence, it was dangerous. What's more, early compasses were flawed. The needles shifted. Variation in magnetic declination was poorly understood, leading ships off course by degrees that could become deadly over long distances. Mariners began referring to the compass with suspicion, capricious, untrustworthy, deaf to the sky. They would use it, but only when forced, when the fog rolled in, when the stars vanished, when the coastline disappeared, and silence ruled. There are records of voyages where captains outright refused to use the compass, even though they carried one. Others would use it in secret, hiding it from the crew to avoid unrest. Some even consulted the compass alongside religious relics or rituals, lighting incense or making offerings before trusting its direction, as if to bribe the gods to keep its path honest. It wasn't until the late medieval period that the compass began to earn its place. Improvements in compass housing, such as dry cards and gimbals to stabilize movement, made it more practical. But the real shift came not from technology, but from culture. As European exploration accelerated in the 15th and 16th centuries, long-distance voyages demanded reliability over ritual. Celestial navigation remained, but the compass, gradually, took center stage. Not because it was loved, but because it became necessary. Still, even then, some navigators refused to let go of the stars. The most experienced pilots would check the compass only after consulting the heavens. They believed, with good reason, that tradition-carried wisdom machines could not. Today, the compass seems almost quaint, reduced to a logo on an app, a backup when satellites fail. But once, it was a revolution in waiting. An idea so strange it had to survive centuries of rejection before being allowed into the heart of human trust. So imagine that sailor again. Standing on the deck of a creaking ship, clouds blotting out the stars, winds shifting without warning. In his hand, a trembling needle points north, but in his bones, he still hears his grandfather's voice describing the way the moon should rise if land is near. And between silence and memory, he must choose. Because in the early days, the compass didn't guide the sailor guided the compass. Paths were burned into the ground by repetition over centuries. He didn't need a signpost, or a star, or even a thought. His feet moved without question, as if pulled by something older than memory. The path beneath him curved through hills, crossed dry riverbeds, and slipped beneath ancient trees whose roots had bent around it over generations. He had never seen a map. He didn't need one. The trail was carved into the earth itself, pressed into place by the weight of countless souls who had come before him. Traders, pilgrims, shepherds, beggars, warriors. All of them walking, all of them marking the land with the rhythm of their survival. And now, centuries later, he was just another footstep on a path that had become permanent by repetition alone. In many parts of the ancient world, Roads didn't begin as grand constructions or royal commands. They began as habit, as need. A shepherd walking to pasture, a family traveling to market, a pilgrim heading toward a holy place. And when enough feet followed the same instinct across the same ground, year after year, decade after decade, the land remembered. Dirt compressed, vegetation parted, stones shifted aside, and over time, these paths, born of routine, not design, became etched into the living body of the landscape. No signs, no borders, just scars in the earth deep enough to outlast empires. These were the desire paths of civilization, the grooves of trade, faith, and survival. In the Sahara, trans-Saharan caravan routes connected salt mines and gold markets across one of the most unforgiving terrains on Earth. The wind erased everything, except the trails. Centuries of camels and men walking single file, always stepping in the footprint ahead, wore invisible roads through dunes. Even today, satellite images reveal faint, ancient corridors, ridges and depressions in the sand where humans once walked under stars for weeks at a time, without maps, just memory, and a path beneath their feet that had been made by others who remembered before them. In Europe, the pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela tell a similar story. What began as scattered footsteps of devotion slowly became rivers of movement. Farmers turned the path with their carts. Monks walked it barefoot. Thieves followed behind. And still, over hundreds of years, the ground sank where the people walked. Some of these trails grew so deeply worn into the hills that even after the forests reclaimed the land around them, the path itself remained, a sunken, muddy scar that leads on, still for those who seek it. The Silk Road, often thought of as a single line across Asia, was really a web of such paths, some narrow and faint, others wide and pressed into stone. In places like the Taklamakan Desert, the sand would shift, erase everything. But traders knew where the wind piled it and where the bones of lost caravans marked false turns. The real paths weren't visible. They were felt, pressed into the logic of the land by centuries of choice and repetition. In Japan, the Kaido, feudal travel roads, began as animal tracks, then became pilgrim routes, then grew into wide, bustling ways between cities. Even today, beneath the paved streets of Tokyo, some subway lines follow the same curves as footpaths first walked by monks during the Heian period. The earth does not forget. Even in the Americas, indigenous footpaths known as travois trails became deeply worn into the plains by generations dragging wooden sleds behind horses or dogs. Some of these grooves are still visible from the air, centuries later, routes made not with shovels or stone, but with persistence. These weren't always direct. Nature shaped them. A bend in the river, a shady tree, a reliable spring. Each nudged the path slightly until its shape settled. And once it settled, it stayed. The soil packed harder with each passing foot. The plants around it learned not to grow there. In time, the path outlived the people. To walk one of these ancient routes was to participate in something collective. Your footstep was not yours alone. It echoed hundreds, thousands of others. You were walking not on history, but within it. Each step was guided by choices long forgotten but still present, inscribed in earth more enduring than ink. No one needed to explain the route. No road markers were necessary. When a traveler arrived in a strange place, they found the path worn like a question already answered. Where to go? The ground already knew, and even when maps came, the old paths remained. Some were paved, some were built over, some turned into highways or train tracks, but many still exist in secret, threaded through forests, etched between ruins, whispering under the noise of the modern world. because the land holds memory in form. And sometimes the most honest map is the one carved by the souls of the forgotten. So if you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, walking a line of earth just a little too smooth, a little too curved to be natural, listen to your feet. You may be stepping on a road older than your name, a path that needed no compass, no ink, only footsteps, repeated, unquestioned, eternal. Trees were carved with directional symbols or clan marks in the deep, silent forests of the ancient world, where sunlight filtered through tangled branches like flickering ghosts, where trails vanished beneath fallen leaves, and every direction felt like the same green cage. Humans learned to speak with trees, not in poetry, but in marks, simple, urgent, survival-bound carvings etched into bark. For travelers, hunters, warriors, and refugees alike, trees became the standing stones of the wild, carved with symbols that told you where to go, who ruled the land, and what dangers waited beyond. Before there were road signs, and long before the forests were cleared for maps and railways, trees carried the messages of the unseen. In places like the dense European woodlands, the Amazon basin, the Himalayan foothills, and African equatorial jungles, deep travel meant disorientation. Paths bent, shifted, disappeared. Rivers flooded trails. Winds erased footprints. But the trees, those stayed. And so people turned them into living guideposts. Wayfinders cut into bark not to harm the tree, but to give it voice. A slash across the trunk might mean this way. A cross carved deeply might warn of a trap, a predator, or a cursed zone. A spiral could signal a water source nearby. In some regions, 2 vertical cuts marked clan territory, a boundary not to be crossed without ritual or risk. Travelers could read these like coded language, passed between generations, understood not by outsiders, but by those who knew the forest as blood. In pre-Roman Europe, particularly among Celtic and Germanic tribes, trees were sacred, but also practical. Carved symbols blended utility with myth. Runes, ancient letter forms, were sometimes used to claim land or point toward distant settlements. Some marked old burial paths or seasonal migration routes. And because trees grew slowly, these carvings could last years, even decades, guiding hunters or messengers season after season. In sub-Saharan Africa, particularly among forest-dwelling tribes, clan marks were etched into certain tree species, usually near paths or fords. These marks didn't just show direction, they were a declaration. You are entering the land of the Red Horn people, or this river belongs to the Bantu elders line. Disrespecting these signs could spark conflict. Honoring them by leaving an offering or marking your passage could mean safe travel. In Australia, Aboriginal groups used scar trees, where bark was carefully removed in patterns to indicate resource sites, such as waterholes, bush medicine, or sacred paths to ceremonial sites. These marks were not vandalism, they were conversation. Ancient GPS embedded in eucalyptus and acacia. Even in North America, Native American trail trees were shaped deliberately. Some were bent as saplings and grown into markers, elbows in the forest pointing toward water, salt licks, or gathering places. Others bore bark carvings, a crescent moon for night shelter, a vertical slash for a river ahead. Hunters read them like road signs. Scouts left warnings with them when danger was near. But perhaps the most fascinating use of carved tree symbols wasn't just navigation, it was memory. In cultures without writing systems, trees held the past. A child might be taken into the forest and shown a series of trees. This one marks where our ancestor fell. That one points to the path we took when the river rose. This one holds the clan mark of the people we no longer speak of. Each mark became a portal to a story, and those who knew how to read them carried an archive of forest history in their minds. Not all marks were made with blades. Some were burned in with heated iron or fire-charred sticks. Others were stained with clay or sap to make the message stand out. In wetter climates where bark healed quickly, symbols had to be refreshed, an act of ritual in itself. In some tribal traditions, only certain elders or trackers were allowed to make such marks. To carve a tree without permission was not only taboo, it was dangerous, spiritually and socially. Even today, remnants of this tradition linger. Forest rangers, hunters, and survivalists still use trailblazes, painted or carved, though modern ones lack the cultural layers of the ancient ones. And deep in old forests, forgotten carved trees sometimes surface, mysterious symbols half swallowed by bark, their meanings now uncertain, their messages lost to time. But what they represent still echoes. That once, when the forest was king and the path was never sure, humans carved their presence into the trunks of giants, not to dominate, but to whisper, "We were here. We passed this way." Follow if you know the code. Turn back if you don't. The trees remember, and if you know where to look, they still speak. Fungi and moss helped determine direction. You're deep in the woods. The sky is hidden behind layers of thick canopy. There are no roads, no signs, no stars to guide you. You don't have a compass, just your instincts. And silence. The kind of silence that begins to pulse in your ears when you realize you might be lost. But then you see it. On the bark of a tree. A soft green bloom. A thick patch of moss. You touch it. Cold. Damp. And suddenly, you know which way is north. This isn't myth. It's history. Long before compasses and maps, before directions were printed and standardized, people found their way by reading the forest itself. And one of their oldest tools wasn't carved from wood or forged from iron. It was moss. In the mist-heavy woods of northern Europe, Scandinavia, and parts of the British Isles, travelers, foragers, hunters, and even soldiers used moss and fungi to orient themselves, not because it was superstition, but because it worked. Moss and lichen tend to grow thickest on the north side of trees. Not because they prefer north, but because in those damp climates, the north-facing side gets the least sunlight. It stays cooler, moister, a perfect cradle for moss. And when you're walking through a forest where every tree looks the same, that patch of green becomes a compass, one rooted in biology, not belief. This method wasn't written down in books for centuries. It was passed orally. A father teaching his son, a hunter teaching his apprentice, a lost child remembering something an elder once muttered by the fire. Find the moss. Follow its shoulder. It points away from the sun. In areas like Finland, moss wasn't just a guide, it was a warning. If you found yourself turned around and couldn't see the sun, moss patterns helped prevent walking in circles, a terrifyingly common fate in dense boreal forests. The same was true for medieval woodcutters in Germany, for Viking scouts in the fjords, and for hermits who wandered for days, living on root and rain, always glancing at bark for that soft, green reassurance. But moss wasn't alone. Fungi joined the story. Shelf mushrooms, those bracket-shaped fungi that grow out from tree trunks, often grow more abundantly on the shaded side as well. In damp climates, that was north. In hotter regions, it might shift depending on terrain, wind, or nearby water. But for those who knew the forest's rhythms, even a cluster of fungi could whisper direction. This wasn't some flawless system. It took awareness, observation, judgment. A single mossy tree meant nothing, but a pattern, dozens of trees all favoring one side, began to speak. And for those who listened, it told them how to find home. In the Scottish Highlands, moss was used not only to find direction, but to mark territory. Certain clans recognized the shapes and colors of lichen patterns unique to their lands. In the Slavic forests, where folklore blurred with reality, moss-covered stones were said to be watched over by forest spirits. If moss covered all sides, you stopped, rested. If only one side, you moved, with the clean side behind you. Even medieval travelers along pilgrimage routes used this knowledge. When waymarkers were missing or stolen, a lone traveler could still navigate through wooded passes by reading how nature leaned. A moss-rich glen meant cool winds, which in turn meant northern exposure. Shadows, moisture, bark texture, all became part of a silent map. And perhaps most fascinating, moss could help not just with direction, but with time. Some travelers observed that dew lingered longer on the moss side in the morning, while sunlight dried the opposite faster. The forest became a kind of breathing clock, ticking in drops and shade. But like so many ancient methods, this quiet wisdom faded as tools advanced. Compasses replaced instincts. Maps replaced memory. But that knowledge never vanished completely. During World War II, resistance fighters in northern forests used moss to orient themselves when compasses were lost or damaged. Arctic explorers trained in indigenous ways used lichen growth to confirm they weren't veering off course. Even today, skilled trackers in Canada and northern Russia still teach moss orientation, not as folklore, but as backup. A second compass, alive and growing. And maybe that's what makes this so haunting, that something as simple as moss, silent, slow, unassuming, once carried the hopes of the lost. It didn't need to shine. It didn't need to move. It just needed to be where it always was, growing where light was weakest, quietly pointing the way. The forest never shouted. It whispered, and those who listened made it through. So the next time you walk beneath thick trees and feel the sky disappear, don't panic. Look for the moss. Run your fingers along the bark. Ask the tree what it knows. It won't answer in words, but it might just show you where north is, and remind you that the oldest compasses in the world were never built. They were grown. Travelers counted steps, or time between landmarks. They didn't measure miles. They didn't draw scales. There were no rulers stretched across the earth. What they had were feet, breath, fire, and memory. Before maps could be trusted, before roads had milestones, before clocks ticked in pockets, travelers measured the world not by what it was, but by what it felt like to move through it. How many steps to the next tree? How long a torch would burn before reaching the river? How many songs until the path bent west? How long it took for the sun to reach a certain height behind the shoulder? To modern ears, it sounds imprecise, but it worked. Because memory wasn't based on numbers, it was based on experience. Across deserts, mountains, jungles, and fields, people moved in rhythms, and they remembered those rhythms as units of distance. A Berber crossing the Sahara didn't ask how many miles to the next well. He might say, "It is 3 fires." Meaning, if you light a fire of dry palm wood now, let it burn down to ash, rest, and walk again. By the 3rd fire, you will see water. In Mesoamerica, traders called Pochteca traveled vast trade routes and spoke of distances in days of walking, in how many times they would need to sleep, or how many bundles of maize they would eat before arriving. And in the cold highlands of Nepal, Sherpa guides still talk of 2-breath climbs, or 5 rest ridges, where altitude, fatigue, and habit merge into a living map that cannot be printed, only felt. This was true even in ancient cities. Romans used paces, a double step, left-right, as their unit of distance. The term mille passos, or 1,000 paces, is where our word mile comes from. But even then, it wasn't just measurement. It was repetition. You walked the same route so often that your legs remembered it for you. Travelers counted not because they wanted precision, but because it told them when to be ready, when to look left for the hidden turn, when to start listening for the stream just over the rise. Step counting wasn't a backup. It was the main system. In Japan, pilgrimage routes were memorized by how many lanterns or steps separated temples. In medieval Europe, shepherds remembered their grazing boundaries by how long it took to recite a psalm while walking from oak to brook. In Finland and the Baltics, forest guides would speak in terms like, "From here to the marsh is the length of one breath held in silence." Not poetic, functional. That was the moment to stop talking, because after that came wolves, or thin ice, or holy ground, and for sailors, distance was counted in time, not space. Before longitude could be calculated, ancient mariners timed travel by how long it took for a candle to burn, or how many heartbeats between stars passing certain points in the sky. In the Indian Ocean, traders estimated crossings by the rhythm of wind changes, by how many days the sails would snap full before the monsoon turned. Even in military campaigns, generals knew the range of their troops not by miles, but by marches. One forced march could be 30 miles, another 12. But what mattered was how many marches to the battlefield, and how many steps before men would fall. This system of step and time wasn't just practical, it was personalized. A child might take 400 steps to reach the tree their father called the border, while the father might take 300. But both would know. When you feel tired, and the wind shifts, and the light changes just so, you're close. And for many, it was sung. Oral cultures preserved distances in chants and verses. A travel song might mark the rhythm of steps. 1, 2, bend the path. 3, 4, pass the stone. 5, 6, taste the stream. The repetition not only measured time, it warned, guided, taught. In this way, every footstep was a line of a verse. These memory systems were not primitive, they were adaptive. When the terrain changed, flooded, snowed, dried out, the numbers still worked. Because they weren't tied to fixed distances. They were tied to human movement. Flexible, sensory, real. Even in cities today, we still use fragments of this. It's 5 minutes from here, we say, not 0.4 miles. Or, it's 3 subway stops. Or, just a quick walk from the station. We live in inherited rhythms, but ancient travelers lived entirely by them. And when night fell, and roads vanished, and all they had was memory, they could still say, "I have 20 steps before the hill turns red, 50 heartbeats before the lake speaks, 1 fire's time before I must choose the left path." No instruments, just rhythm, just breath. Just the map their body carried, etched not in paper, but in muscle and time. Nomadic tribes used seasonal stars as migration signals. In the vast, open silence of the steppe, where there are no roads, no fences, and no permanent homes, a boy once lay on his back beside a dying fire, eyes fixed on a sky so wide it seemed to swallow thought itself. Around him, the clans felt tents stood still. Horses grazed in shadow. Elders whispered over coals. And overhead, the stars were changing. A single constellation, long familiar, now slightly shifted, emerged over the horizon. He didn't know the name his ancestors had given it, but he knew what it meant. It was time to move. Among nomadic peoples across Central Asia and Northern Africa, navigation was not bound to the earth. It was written in the sky. For millennia, migratory tribes read the stars not for poetry or myth alone, but for timing. The slow rise of certain constellations, some barely visible to the untrained eye, functioned as living calendars. They signaled when to break camp, when to head south before the frost, when to climb toward alpine pastures, when to avoid the dry riverbeds. The heavens were not symbols. They were instructions. This celestial system wasn't theoretical. It was memorized, lived, and inherited. A child born into a nomadic family learned early that movement was never random. The stars were discussed around fires like relatives. When the scorpion rises, we pack the sheep pens. When the lion's eye clears the hill, we do not cross the desert. The sky was the guide, the clock, the law. Among Central Asian tribes like the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Turkmen, star-based migration was integral to survival. These herders moved seasonally, transhumance, from winter lowlands to summer highlands and back. While terrain and memory guided the how, it was the sky that dictated when. The rising of the Pleiades in spring signaled the beginning of upward movement toward cooler pastures. Its disappearance in autumn meant retreat before the snows. To misread this signal was to risk the lives of entire herds, and with them, the survival of the family. Further south, in the deserts of northern Africa, Berber and Tuareg tribes relied just as heavily on the sky. In the Sahara, landmarks shift with wind and time. Dunes are swallowed and reborn overnight, but the stars are eternal. And so, desert clans watched Orion rise like a blade over the horizon. When Sirius appeared before dawn, it meant the floods were coming to the Nile and its tributaries. It was time to seek new trade routes, or avoid roads that would soon disappear in mud and water. To these nomads, the stars were not just above, they were ahead. These practices weren't superstition. They were science embedded in rhythm. By tracking the heliacal rising of key stars, the first visible appearance of a star just before sunrise, nomadic peoples created systems of timing far older than most calendars. They noticed that certain constellations always returned with specific winds, specific flowers, specific changes in the animals. And because oral tradition preserved this knowledge without ink, it survived in the only way that mattered, through action. A song remembered when the goat star rose. A poem taught when the night became too cold to stay. These were not decorations of the intellect. They were operational tools, and they were trusted. The sky also ensured unity. When vast tribes split across miles of land, watching the stars meant they could move in synchronized rhythm without seeing one another. A constellation didn't just guide a single family, it coordinated an entire culture. Migration paths overlapped. Trade could occur. Peace was kept. The stars ensured cohesion even when geography separated people. But there was more than practicality. There was reverence. For many of these tribes, the sky was not only a guide, it was a sacred presence. The stars were ancestors, watchers, spirits of memory. To follow them wasn't just tactical, it was respectful. To ignore them was arrogance, and often punished by hardship. If a journey began before the right star had risen, the herds might fail. If one lingered after the warning constellation dipped below the hills, they might not outrun the frost. Even today, remnants of this star-guided life persist. In remote regions of Mongolia, herders still glance skyward before deciding whether to pack camp. In the Atlas Mountains, older Berbers can point out constellations invisible to most modern travelers and name the season they rule, not because they read it, but because they remembered it, because someone taught them, under the stars, in a story that was never written, but always known. What we call astronomy, they lived as biography. The sky wasn't abstract, it was inherited, a generational script, a map of movement in light. And so, the boy on the step, watching that first star rise, he understood, not through calculation, but through instinct bred from generations. Tomorrow they would move. And though the land ahead was silent, the sky had spoken. The stars never shouted. They never changed suddenly. But when they moved, so did the world beneath them. Not because of magic, because of memory. Because once, and perhaps still, the sky was the first map. Ancient caravans used the sun's rise angle to set morning course. The desert did not forgive the lost. It stretched endlessly in every direction, its silence broken only by wind and the slow groan of beasts burdened with silk, salt, or spice. For the leader of the caravan, getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it was fatal. There were no trees to follow, no rivers to trace, no landmarks that lasted longer than a shifting dune, but there was always the sun. And so, each morning before the camp stirred, the guide rose in silence, climbed to the highest point of the dunes, and waited. Not for heat, not for light, but for angle, the exact breath of golden light over the eastern horizon that would whisper the direction of survival. Long before magnetic compasses became widespread in the ancient world, desert navigators used the rising sun not just to tell time, but to orient entire caravans. In arid regions from the Arabian Peninsula to the Saharan expanse and the Central Asian steppe, the angle of the sunrise acted as a cosmic pointer. Subtle, but dependable. It wasn't superstition. It was geometry. And for the skilled caravan master, it was as essential as water. The principle was deceptively simple. The sun rises in the east, yes, but not in the same place every day. Its angle at sunrise shifts with the seasons, tilting slightly northward or southward depending on the time of year. Desert guides learned to read this movement with incredible precision. By noting exactly where on the horizon the sun crested, they could determine not just the time, but their latitude, and more importantly, the direction in which they should begin their day's journey. These guides didn't carry tools in the way we imagine. Many relied on the natural horizon, watching how the first rays of light struck rock formations, sand ripples, or the shadows of their own bodies. Some placed upright sticks in the sand and measured the shadow's tilt the moment the sun emerged. Over years, decades even, they developed an internal compass tied not to technology, but to light. Arabian desert caravans, especially those traveling the incense and spice routes from Yemen to Damascus, depended heavily on this solar technique. The Rahal, or desert navigator, was not just a pathfinder. He was a living clock and compass. Paid more than most traders, he carried the knowledge of how far the sun would rise off true east in each season. In winter, it tilted southeast. In summer, northeast. This meant that without needing a single chart, he could determine orientation simply by sitting still and watching the morning sun climb. In the Sahara, Tuareg guides did the same. With veiled faces and boundless patience, they would sit in silence, watching how the first golden line fell across the sand dunes. The shape of shadows told them whether the path would stay true or whether they needed to adjust slightly northward to avoid deadly salt flats or dune clusters that could trap an entire caravan. The technique wasn't exclusive to the Middle East or North Africa. Ancient Persian, Turkic, and Indian traders crossing open lands also used sunrise angles for initial bearings. Once set, they followed wind patterns, star positions, and land memory. But that first orientation, just after dawn, was always by sun. And it wasn't just east they measured. By watching the rate of ascent, how high the sun rose by a given time, they could predict the intensity of the day's heat and determine how far they could travel before needing to stop. A low, slow sun meant mist or morning haze. A sharp, fast rise meant brutal heat ahead. This helped calculate rest stops, water rations, and when to break for shade. These skills were never written. They were inherited, passed from elder to apprentice, from caravan master to quiet-eyed boy who walked at the front and asked no questions for years. Because the sun did not forgive impatience, it rewarded attention, repetition, humility. One wrong heading at sunrise could mean veering dozens of miles off course by midday, enough to miss the only water source for days. And while merchants recorded trade values, dates, and goods, few ever recorded how they actually got across the emptiness alive. That was the realm of the guide. He would rise before anyone else, feel the morning wind, scan the horizon, and nod. Then he would give a silent hand gesture. No fanfare, no speech. But the caravan would fall in behind him. Hundreds of camels, drivers, traders, guards, because he had seen the angle of light and knew the path. Even today, some desert guides still practice this method, not out of necessity anymore, but tradition. Because no matter how modern tools evolve, they know what their ancestors knew. The sun does not lie. It rises where it should. It climbs as it always has, and if you know how to read it, it will take you home. So when you think of ancient caravans crossing endless sand, don't just imagine the camels or the loads of silk. Think of the quiet figure on the dune before dawn, staring into a cold sky, waiting for that one slant of gold to crack the horizon. In that moment, he holds not a direction, but destiny. A silent agreement with the heavens, and with it, he leads the living safely across the land where nothing else endures. Local smells guided movement through unfamiliar lands. In the days before maps, before road markers, or landmarks carved in stone, when a traveler walked through vast, unfamiliar terrain, it wasn't always sight or stars that led them. It was scent. A drifting ribbon of salt on the wind, the pungent tang of livestock, the smoky sweetness of baking bread, a hint of pine resin or dungfire smoke. These were not just smells, they were directions, invisible compass points carried on the breeze, rooted in the memory of home. For ancient villagers and nomads alike, smell was a survival tool, one of the first senses to develop in a child, and one of the last to fade in the dying. And unlike sight, which could be tricked by fog, or sound, which could be swallowed by wind, smell lingered. It saturated the earth. It clung to skin, trees, stones, and breath. In cultures that walked the land rather than ruled it, people learned to read the air through their nose. A shepherd might sniff the air before dusk and know if another village was nearby. Baking bread means humans. Manure means cattle. The faint oil of pressed olives means we're near a mill. Fishermen who strayed too far inland would wait for the tang of salt air to return before steering back. Hunters, moving through thick forests, tracked not only animals but distant cook fires, the musty exhale of a barn, the herbal smoke of a healer's hut. Smell was not secondary. It was orientation. In some African and Middle Eastern regions, traders and camel drivers used the scent of dry thorn trees, goat musk, and specific flowering plants to judge proximity to known oases. In China and Southeast Asia, the smell of certain incense blends or fermented food smoke was associated with specific ethnic groups or towns. Even without ever seeing them, a traveler might say, "This is where the rice is steamed in banana leaves. That means we are nearing the river clan." Smell became a cultural signature. In European forests and valleys, people associated smell with seasonal movement. The scent of wet pine and fresh rot meant spring floods. The acrid smoke of burning dung told of a highland encampment. In cities, the air changed street by street. Fish markets, bakeries, tanneries, breweries, each with its own scent-based footprint. It was said that blind beggars in medieval towns could navigate more precisely than sighted strangers because they memorized the city's scent map. And for villagers who had to flee, due to war, famine, or flood, the nose could be a tether to the past. Oral histories speak of people following the smell of sheep dung or clay smoke to return home after years displaced. Refugees could tell how far they were from their homeland not by distance, but by the absence of familiar smell. The air no longer smells like barley. There is no sour beer on the wind. That absence was not just disorienting, it was grief. This scent mapping was also emotionally encoded. Smells trigger memory more intensely than any other sense, and ancient peoples harnessed this. A child raised in a mountain village would always associate the sharp breath of spruce resin and cheese smoke with safety. As an adult, smelling those again, even in a far-off land, could bring tears, orientation, or a burst of courage. In some traditions, this knowledge was formalized. Nomadic groups in Siberia and Mongolia trained children to recognize up to 100 distinct smells associated with home. Aboriginal Australians include scent references in songlines, musical maps used to remember and navigate vast distances. One line might mention where a flower's scent turns sour, indicating a nearby swamp or sacred site. In the Amazon, indigenous guides still follow scent trails invisible to outsiders, noting where bird droppings change odor, or when river air turns metallic before a storm. Even ritual practices were shaped by this. Sacred processions burned specific herbs whose smoke would carry far, telling the countryside that a holy day had begun. Villagers miles away would smell it and orient themselves socially and spiritually, knowing what day it was, what prayers to recite, what emotions to hold. In modern times, much of this sensitivity has faded. Air is choked with pollutants, our homes sealed with artificial climates, our noses dulled by distance from land. But deep in the nervous system, this instinct remains. A person lost in a foreign place still feels the jolt of recognition when they smell fresh bread, dry grass, or firewood smoke. The body remembers what the mind forgets. So imagine someone walking alone at dusk through unfamiliar hills. No guide, no sun, just the cool wind. They stop, inhale. There it is, a faint trace of roasted grain and livestock dung. Not pleasant, but home. And so they turn, not toward what they see, but toward what they smell. The land doesn't speak in signs, it speaks in scent. And those who listened, they never truly got lost. Shamanic and spiritual leaders interpreted natural omens. There were those who carried maps, and there were those who read the sky. But in many ancient cultures, long before the compass or the astrolabe, the true guides weren't the ones with tools or charts. They were the ones who could listen to the invisible, the ones who could read a shift in the wind, the cry of a bird, or the curl of a cloud, and hear a message meant only for them. These were the spiritual navigators, the shamans, the seers, the dreamwalkers, and in their hands, direction wasn't calculated. It was revealed. Across cultures, from the steppes of Mongolia to the Amazon rainforest, from Arctic tundras to the savannas of East Africa, travel and movement were never purely physical acts, they were spiritual decisions. Before a journey began, there were signs to be read, omens to be checked, not just to determine a route, but to know whether the journey should happen at all. In Siberian tribes, the shaman would enter trance before a hunt or a migration, guided by rhythmic drumming and smoke. In that altered state, they said they could see the path unfold, see rivers, obstacles, even danger waiting days ahead. They didn't just read the land, they saw through it. In Polynesia, where wayfinding was already an art of stars and swells, spiritual consultation still played a role. If a bird flew a certain way at dawn, if a rainbow curved low, if the ocean sounded different in a dream, these were signs. A voyage might be delayed or redirected entirely based on a single omen. The Navajo, Lakota, and other indigenous North American nations had their own spiritual interpreters, often elders or medicine men, who observed not only weather but animal behavior. If crows circled the wrong direction, if frogs stopped croaking, If the clouds stacked in unnatural forms, it meant something was wrong with the path ahead. Movement wasn't just a question of where, but of when. These spiritual signs weren't decoration. They were law, because the world was seen as alive, not metaphorically, but literally. The wind had moods, the trees had warnings, the sky had opinions, and those who could interpret these messages were more important than any physical map. In the Himalayas, before a caravan crossed treacherous passes, monks might burn incense and observe how the smoke curled, whether it flowed east or danced low to the ground. This determined whether the gods approved of the journey. In ancient Ethiopia, Christian mystics watched the flights of vultures, believing that angels could ride their wings as silent messengers. In West African traditions, diviners tossed cowrie shells or read the patterns of disturbed sand, asking not just for direction, but for protection. And always, these signs were personal. A gust of wind wasn't just weather. It might be an ancestor reminding you to turn back. A sudden bird call wasn't random. It might be the earth warning of unseen danger. To the outsider, it might seem like superstition. But to those who lived by it, it was the only thing that made sense. Because when your survival depended on the land, when you had no written record, no second chance, the world itself became your oracle. And the deeper you listened, the clearer it spoke. Even the famed Tuareg of the Sahara, desert nomads with an uncanny sense of direction, relied on spiritual readers to bless their caravans. A single mirage, a certain shadow in the sand, or the silence of a normally vocal bird could signal an ambush ahead, or a hidden well gone dry. In these systems, direction was never mechanical. It was relational. You didn't move through the land. You moved with it. The path wasn't chosen. It was granted. And only the spiritually attuned could sense its edges. In modern times, some of this wisdom has been lost, silenced, replaced by instruments and grids and numbers. But traces remain. In the Arctic, Inuit elders still speak of Sila, the spirit of weather, whose moods must be read with respect. In parts of Indonesia, fishermen still refuse to sail if the wind doesn't carry the right smell. And in the Amazon, bird songs are still interpreted not just as sound, but as prophecy. It's easy now to laugh at omens, but maybe the real question is this: what have we lost in forgetting how to listen? We chase clarity through algorithms, but ancient people found it in the sky, in the bend of a tree. In the moment, a cloud paused just a little too long above the horizon. These signs weren't proof. They were presence, reminders that the world wasn't background. It was alive. And the journey wasn't just physical. It was sacred. So the next time you walk outside and the wind shifts suddenly, or a bird lands silently nearby and stares a little too long, pause. Not everything needs to be measured. Some things are meant to be noticed. Because once, long ago, a traveler stood where you stand, unsure which path to take, and waited for the earth itself to whisper an answer. Desert nomads used sand dune patterns like road maps. He stood at the crest of a dune that looked like every other. Waves of sand stretching to the horizon, wind whispering over the peaks, no signs, no tracks, only endless golden silence. But to him, it wasn't empty. It was a language, a living map drawn not in ink, but in motion. He looked at the tilt of the ridge, the shadow beneath the crest, the way the grains shifted beneath his feet. Then he turned, without hesitation, and began to walk. He was not lost. He was reading. For the Tuareg of the Sahara and the Bedouin of the Arabian deserts, the dunes were not obstacles. They were guides. Shifting, yes, but not random. The wind has rules. The sand has memory. And the people who learned those rules, who listened to the rhythm of the earth, could travel hundreds of miles without compass or stars, through terrain that changed shape daily. Because to the desert nomads, the dunes were not chaos. They were structure. Every dune had a direction. Wind carves them in consistent angles depending on the season. In the Sahara, the ergs, seas of sand, form massive ridges known as saif dunes, long and sharp like blades. Their crests often run parallel to the prevailing wind. Tuareg navigators could tell at a glance which wind had shaped the dunes. If the slope was steep on one side and smooth on the other, they knew which way the wind had come and which way to go. It's easy to imagine the desert as featureless, but that's only if you don't know how to see. To the trained eye, no two dunes are the same. Some ripple like water. Some are wide like sleeping whales. Others are scarred by slip faces or pockmarked by pebbles, each a sign, a marker, a reminder. One might say, the dune shaped like a camel's knee points to the dry well. The one that hums at sunset leads to the red stones. These aren't metaphors, they're navigation. And it wasn't just sight, it was feel. A Tuareg might walk barefoot to read the heat of the sand. Cooler grains meant the shadow side, meaning west. The Bedouin might kneel and scoop a handful, letting it slip through his fingers, reading the dryness or fineness to judge how far from the coast the wind had traveled. Fine sand often meant a long carry, meaning you were far from rocky ground, far from mountains. Time to veer toward shelter. They listened to the wind at night. When the air cooled and the dunes stopped moving, a stillness settled in that told experienced nomads where they were, based on how long the wind had ceased and whether the silence came earlier or later than the season before. Even the stars, while helpful, were not the final tool, because storms could blot out the sky. But the sand, always, could still be read. Some dunes sang, literally. Under the right conditions, sand sliding down steep slopes creates a deep, vibrating hum, a booming dune. Certain nomads knew which dunes sang at which time of year. If you heard the right note, you knew where you were. You knew you were close. And in the most desolate places, where no landmarks could be seen, they used shadows. A line of shadows on the leeward side of a series of dunes at midday could tell you where the ancient caravan path once passed. These weren't official roads. They were remembered roads, maintained not by signs, but by generations of people who passed knowledge mouth to ear, father to child, rider to rider. Even modern satellite imagery confirms this. Ancient trans-Saharan trade routes align with consistent dune formations. For hundreds of years, traders moved salt, gold, and slaves along invisible corridors marked not by stones, but by sand patterns. This was true navigation, not of distance, but of familiarity. Every route was a story. You cross 7 high dunes. You find the flat place with no wind. You rest until the white stone appears. Then you turn when the sand stings your left cheek. They didn't count miles. They counted moments. And when they taught this knowledge, it wasn't in classrooms. It was in motion. A boy might ride beside his uncle for months before understanding that the curved dune ahead wasn't just another hill. It was the sign of a storm path, a danger zone, a place where many had turned too late. For outsiders, this skill was invisible. Many European explorers died in deserts they assumed were empty because they couldn't read the sand. They walked in circles, failed to find water, drowned in dunes that to nomads were familiar as home streets. Because the desert isn't empty. It's coded. You just need the right eyes. And that's what the Tuareg and Bedouin carried, not just water or cloth, but vision, the ability to look at something constantly changing and still find meaning, still find direction. In modern times, some of these skills are fading. GPS and satellite maps have replaced stories. But in the deep desert, when machines fail and screens go dark, the dunes still whisper. They still point. They still sing. And those who remember still listen. Because to them, the desert was never a mystery. It was a map that moved, and they were the ones who could read it. Travelers learned wind-borne dust, signatures of distant cities. Long before towers rose on the horizon or rooftops glinted beneath the sun, travelers knew they were nearing a city not by sight, but by breath. A wind would shift, faint, dry, and carrying with it something unmistakable. A subtle sting of lime dust, a trace of smoke-soaked spices, a note of brine or rotting fig. The breeze didn't whisper a name, but it told a story. A city is near. Long before the domes or banners appeared, the air itself spoke. In the ancient world, where the land was wide and signals were sparse, seasoned travelers, caravan leaders, desert nomads, wandering merchants, developed an almost animal sensitivity to airborne signatures. They knew which winds brought wordless warnings and which carried invitation. This wasn't magic. It was survival. A city could mean food, water, trade, or danger. And when your life was measured by distance and dust, knowing what wind you were walking into meant everything. Certain cities left invisible trails that seasoned wayfarers could read without maps. In North Africa, trans-Saharan caravans relied not only on stars and dunes, but on the scent and color of incoming winds. A sudden shift to a gritty, copper-tinged dust meant Fez was still days away. A salty edge riding a hot breeze foretold the proximity of Tunis. Traders from the Sahel described the peculiar sharpness of wind near the walls of ancient Gao, mineral-rich and tinged with the breath of thousands of cooking fires. The phenomenon wasn't imagined. It was real, physical. Cities altered their environment. Waste, markets, kilns, livestock, clay, human sweat, all merged into a microclimate of scent and particulate matter. When winds passed through, they lifted this airborne signature and carried it for miles. A well-trained nose could distinguish the difference between a coastal breeze brushed by sea-soaked fish markets and an inland gust laced with charcoal and sandalwood. In the deserts of Arabia, Bedouins spoke of recognizing settlements by wind print alone. The closer they approached an oasis village or town, the more they relied on the smell of water, dung, smoke, and spices, lifted and carried by thermal currents that revealed presence long before the eye could confirm it. One wind, hot and dry, might carry nothing, but a wind of equal speed and direction, arriving a week later, might come tasting of figs and dusted with soot. That meant someone had arrived. The settlement had changed. A caravan had passed. The wind was memory. In ancient India, coastal travelers arriving by land from the Deccan Plateau described the unmistakable air of the port city of Muziris. Winds from the west brought the smell of pepper, so much of it ground and packed in open sacks that the scent could carry for hours. Arab travelers wrote that one could detect the sneeze of the port days before it was visible. The Chinese, too, recognized wind-borne signs. Han Dynasty records mention certain winds blowing down from the north that carried foreign dust, a phrase often used when embassies or traders from nomadic regions were expected. It wasn't superstition. Horses smelled different. Nomads wore different oils. And when they moved, the wind remembered. In ancient Rome, port guards stationed along the Via Appia were trained not only in martial awareness, but in environmental signs. A southerly wind could mean ships had docked at Ostia. If the gusts smelled of fish brine and olive press, it meant carts were already inbound. If they carried the sharp odor of burning tallow or unfamiliar spice, foreign traders had arrived. More subtle still was the knowledge that dust itself changed from city to city. A city built on chalk emitted a pale, whisper-light grit. One built on volcanic ash left behind a heavier, darker coating. Travelers knew not just how far they were, but which city they were approaching, based on what color dust coated their boots at dawn. The wind was both letter and signature. This knowledge wasn't reserved for elites. It belonged to guides, shepherds, messengers. Passed orally, learned through repetition, it was tested with every journey. To misread the air could mean arriving too early, too late, or in the wrong city altogether. To read it well meant earning trust, trade, even safety. In later centuries, as roads improved and maps became more widespread, these wind-borne cues faded from cultural memory. The art of listening to the air became poetic rather than practical. But echoes survive. In some Saharan tribes, elder guides still claim to know when a storm carries Algerian dust or Mauritanian salt. In parts of Mongolia, horsemen still speak of smoke wind, a subtle shift that means another yurt camp lies ahead. What we now call environmental sensing was once intuitive. The world offered clues, not in signs or words, but in dust, smell, warmth, and change. And those who lived closest to the road knew how to read it with astonishing precision. So imagine the traveler, waking in a desert hollow, brushing the grit from his lips. The wind has changed. It tastes of burned wood and stale bread. The sound of his mule's breathing sharpens. He closes his eyes and whispers, "It's near." Not because he saw it, not because he dreamed it, but because the city spoke. Through the wind, echo patterns in canyons helped locate exits. He stood at the canyon's bend, surrounded by towering rock walls that turned every breath into a whispering chorus. The path behind him was gone, lost in the labyrinth of stone, sun, and silence. No trail markers, no stars to guide, just vertical cliffs and a light that played tricks on depth and space. But he didn't panic. He didn't guess. Instead, he clapped his hands. Once. The sound cracked like a whip, and then returned. Not once, but twice, each echo fainter, each delay stretched by distance. He closed his eyes, counted, listened, turned towards the shortest return, and walked. Because in this place, where sight betrayed and steps echoed forever, sound was a map, and the echoes, if you understood them, could lead you home. Long before acoustic science had equations, before sonar or mapping tools, ancient people living in rocky landscapes learned to use echo patterns as guides. They didn't need instruments. They had ears, memory, and instinct. In winding canyons, echo behavior became a survival skill. Shouts, claps, drum beats, even sharp rocks tapped against the wall could return vital information. How wide is this canyon? How far until the walls open? Which direction leads out? It wasn't magic. It was physics applied through repetition. When you make a sound in a canyon, it travels outward, strikes walls, and reflects back at a speed determined by distance. A fast echo meant a nearby wall. A delayed one meant space. Multiple echoes, overlapping and staggered, meant irregular bends or branching paths. People learned not just to hear the echo, but to read it. Among indigenous groups in the American Southwest, where the red rock canyons could stretch for miles and fold in upon themselves like living mazes, such knowledge was passed quietly from generation to generation. Echoes weren't just curiosity, they were navigational tools. A sharp whistle might return in a single, clean pulse, indicating a narrow exit just ahead. A hollow, slow echo suggested a wide-open basin or a sheer cliff beyond. Young boys were taught by elders to identify dead ends by their sound. If the echo returned too quickly, too tight, it meant turn back. In parts of the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau, mountain guides used echo calls during fog or snowfall to judge cliffside passages. A single chant or yell, repeated at intervals, helped detect both nearby hazards and possible ways through high rock corridors. Even shepherds in the Andes or Alps, when moving through deep valleys, used echo tests at dawn to decide grazing paths. The quality of the echo told them not just about distance, but acoustics shaped by moisture, weather, and rock type. Desert traders, too, learned the secret. In narrow sandstone passages across the Middle East and North Africa, echoes became directional. Caravan leaders would test passages with sharp sounds and listen. Left might offer a long, warbling return, too wide, too exposed. Right, a sharper, faster rebound, suggesting a tighter, safer canyon with possible exit points. In some ancient cities built near or into rocky terrain, like Petra or Cappadocia, architects even designed spaces to enhance or control echo patterns. Religious ceremonies, military signals, even waterway warnings relied on echo awareness. But out in the wild, it was a lifeline. A skilled echo navigator didn't just judge delay time. They read tone, density, rhythm. The difference between a canyon widening ahead versus branching to the left was subtle, but clear to the trained. Some echoes would flutter, meaning a split or shallow rock curve. Others would come back heavy and compressed, a vertical dead end. And over years, the mind built a library of patterns, each one matched with landscape shapes that had been walked dozens of times. Even today, hikers and climbers often report the eerie accuracy of echo-based orientation. When lost, many instinctively test the environment with sound. Those who understand it can still use echoes to approximate space, particularly in slot canyons, ravines, or glacier-cut valleys. Modern acousticians have measured these techniques and found them remarkably accurate. A practiced human can estimate space within several meters just by echo delay, comparable in some conditions to early handheld sonar. But in ancient times, it wasn't measured. It was felt. It was listening not just for the return, but for the silence in between, the air's tension, the shape of a canyon's breath. People knew how to walk into a blind corridor of stone and find their way not by looking, but by listening. And sometimes, when the echoes faded entirely, when the sound didn't return at all, it meant open land ahead, a clearing, an exit. So next time you find yourself surrounded by high stone walls or lost in the hush of some ancient gorge, don't rely only on your eyes. Make a sound. Listen. Wait for the reply. Because the rocks remember. They always answer. And if you've learned how to hear them, the echoes will lead you through. Ancient letters and seals. Sometimes contained hidden route clues. In the world of ancient trade, where fortunes crossed deserts, empires, and oceans on the backs of camels and ships, navigation was a deadly art. Routes were treacherous, territories hostile, and information, the real kind, not the public kind, was power. So merchants, guild leaders, and royal agents devised something quietly ingenious. They embedded directions into letters and seals, hidden clues, encoded paths, fragments of maps disguised as greetings, blessings, or merchant contracts. A courier might carry a seemingly harmless scroll, but to those who knew how to read it, it whispered the way. These were the first secret map codes, long before espionage had a name, long before encryption had theory. Because in a world where robbers, spies, or rival houses could intercept a messenger at any mile, openly writing a trade route or safe house location was unthinkable. So, merchants learned to bury the truth in formality. In the Middle East, clay tablets from the Assyrian and Babylonian periods have been found with oddly specific inventory lists, mentioning quantities of spices, tools, or cloth in peculiar, repetitive sequences. At first, scholars thought them mistakes, but closer study revealed patterns. The number and order of items mirrored caravan stops. For those in the merchant circle, 3 lengths of wool, 5 oils, 2 incense cones, might mean 3 days west to Wooltown, 5 valleys to the olive grove, 2 ridges to the temple. It wasn't inventory, it was itinerary. In Egypt, wax-sealed papyri often bore symbols pressed into the wax: a scarab, a reed, a boat. Common enough to pass inspection, but their placement on the seal, rotation, or pairing gave hidden meaning. A seal with a left-facing scarab meant travel by desert route. Right-facing? Follow the canal. Some seals were double-stamped, and only those who had the matching seal ring knew how to decode the correct reading order. Roman merchants and officials, especially those operating near military zones or along the Silk Road, frequently used phrases loaded with subtext. A letter might open with, "The sun rose early behind the orchard gates," which, when decoded, could mean "take the eastern pass behind the olive farm." Even addresses could be misleading. Writing to Gaius at House of Seven Vines might refer to a disguised inn in a border town, not a literal vineyard. In ancient India, traders on spice routes developed full systems of symbolic shorthand using dots, lines, and stylized letters woven into the edges of contracts. These weren't accidental flourishes. They were route instructions. Some involved layered ink, where heat or moisture would reveal additional symbols, a primitive form of steganography. Even more astonishing, some Chinese silk merchants are believed to have encoded travel hints in poetry and calligraphy. A farewell verse sent with a courier might read like sentimentality, but contain embedded references to rivers, mountains, or wind patterns. Where the crane flies west at dusk, follow the pine that leans to listen, wasn't just poetic, it was route code. This wasn't limited to written words. In the medieval Islamic world, merchant seals often bore geometric patterns, seemingly decorative, but secretly directional. A pattern with 4 interlocking squares might indicate a crossroads or 4-day journey. Some were even rotated on purpose. Upright meant safe. Rotated 90 degrees? Danger. Avoid this road. The brilliance of these hidden clues lay in deniability. A merchant captured by bandits or questioned by customs could hand over their letter and say, truthfully, "It's just a purchase order." The message would pass through dozens of hands, and only one, maybe 2, would see the real map drawn in metaphor, ink blot, or carved wax. Why so elaborate? Because the stakes were enormous. A merchant's knowledge of safe wells, bandit-free mountain passes, or smuggler-friendly harbors was worth more than gold. And rival houses, imperial patrols, or foreign agents were always listening. So secrecy became survival. In time, these systems grew into formal traditions. Trade guilds across Persia and Central Asia trained their apprentices in silent reading, the art of decoding phrasal roots. In port cities like Venice, certain merchant houses used specific seal presses and poetic formats that could only be interpreted if you'd trained under the same master. It was cartography through lineage. Today, most of these codes are lost. The letters remain, some sealed, some cracked, some crumbling in museum drawers, but their true meanings sleep in forgotten patterns. Historians occasionally spot them. A suspicious repetition, a too poetic letter from a typically blunt merchant, a seal that rotates against the grain. They hint at a world where every message had a second voice, speaking quietly behind the ink. So imagine a dusty parchment handed from one calloused hand to another, a letter of trade, nothing more, or so it seems. But hidden in the shape of the script, the order of items, the wax's strange tilt, is a path through mountains, a route past death, a shortcut to wealth. The ink says one thing, but the road listens to another. Pilgrims followed the footprints of saints and holy paths. They walked where others had walked before. Not kings, not soldiers, but saints. Men and women who, in life or in legend, had wandered the same hills, crossed the same rivers, wept on the same stones. And for centuries, pilgrims followed. Not maps, not roads, but footprints. Traces of sanctity impressed into the earth and memory. Because to walk where a saint had walked was to feel closer to heaven. To walk the path of a miracle was to borrow its holiness. These weren't random wanderings. These were sacred tracks, roots so deeply etched into the soul of a people that even when the landmarks changed, the direction didn't. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa, people didn't just journey toward shrines. They followed the paths the saints themselves had once taken to get there. Paths that were remembered not in writing, but in story, song, and stone. The most famous of these was the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. Stretching across northern Spain, it was believed to mirror the route St. James himself took after bringing Christianity to Iberia, and later, the path his relics took after death. Pilgrims didn't just go to his tomb. They followed his footsteps. Every bend, every village, every tree with a shell nailed into it marked a spot where he, or his legend, had passed. But it wasn't just Europe. In Ethiopia, pilgrims followed the journey of the Ark of the Covenant to Aksum, believing the ground it crossed remained blessed. In India, countless devotees still walk the Char Dham, tracing the ancient paths of Vishnu, Shiva, and saints who wandered through mountains and jungle. In Japan, the Kumano-Kodo pilgrimage trails wove through thick forest, echoing the steps of emperors and ascetics who once climbed those sacred slopes seeking purification. These weren't easy paths. They weren't paved. Some passed through deserts, some through rain-slick cliffs. But the hardship was part of the holiness. Every blister, every missed step, every cold night under open sky was a form of devotion. And people came from everywhere, the poor, the sick, the broken, hoping that walking in holy footsteps might heal what could not be healed by time or medicine. In medieval England, the route to Canterbury, made famous by Chaucer, was a living testament to St. Thomas Becket, murdered in his own cathedral. Pilgrims followed the same streets he had once walked as archbishop, and along the way, inns, wells, and even trees were named after him. If he had stopped to drink somewhere, that spot became a shrine. If he had once prayed beneath a tree, that tree was now sacred. Because holiness, they believed, could linger. It wasn't just found in relics or bones. It could soak into the ground. And if you followed that trail with faith, some of that grace might soak into you. What's remarkable is how consistent these paths remained. Even as cities rose and fell, even when wars redrew borders, these pilgrimage routes endured. They were remembered by barefoot travelers who couldn't write their own names, but could describe every turn of the road with perfect clarity. There's a rock shaped like a saint's ear. You pass that, then the oak that never drops its leaves, then the hill where the wind always changes. That's the way. Even more haunting? Some of these paths align with older, pre-Christian sacred routes, pagan tracks, druid lines, shamanic trails. It's as if the land itself remembered where the holy had walked, long before anyone named them saints. And each new religion simply added its own footprints to the ancient rhythm beneath. These weren't just physical journeys, they were metaphysical ones. People believed that walking the same path as a saint realigned your soul, that your sins could fall away with every mile, that your questions might be answered, not by arrival, but by motion. And for many, that proved true. Even today, millions still walk these routes. Not always for religion, sometimes for clarity, sometimes for healing, sometimes just to feel what others once felt. And as they walk, they pass the same trees, the same streams, the same ridges where travelers once stopped, looked up, and whispered a prayer into the sky. The footprints are gone, of course. Time has wiped them clean. But the paths remain, not just in dirt and stone, but in memory, in story, in yearning. Because deep down, we all want to believe that someone holy once stood where we stand, that the ground beneath our feet remembers something sacred, and maybe it does.